Deep beneath the surface of the western Pacific Ocean, nearly 7 miles down in absolute darkness, lies the Mariana Trench, and at its deepest point sits the Challenger Deep, a place so remote and hostile that fewer humans have stood there than have walked on the moon. The pressure at this depth reaches nearly 16,000 pounds per square inch, a force so immense that it would instantly crush any human body into an unrecognizable form, while the temperature hovers just above freezing at around 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The darkness is complete and total, an absolute absence of sunlight that has persisted for billions of years, creating an environment where life itself seems impossible, yet somehow thrives in forms we barely understand. Only specially designed submersibles with hulls of titanium and other exotic materials can withstand such conditions, and even these remarkable vessels represent years of engineering and millions of dollars in investment just to reach the bottom for a few brief hours. What makes the Challenger Deep so psychologically compelling is precisely what makes it so inaccessible to us, for the human mind craves understanding of the unknown, and yet this place represents perhaps the ultimate frontier of human knowledge, a location so difficult to reach that we know more about distant planets than we do about our own ocean floor. Our natural inclination drives us to explore and document everything, yet the sheer logistics and danger involved make such exploration an almost mythical undertaking, something reserved only for the most advanced nations and the most determined scientists. Despite living on a planet that is 70% water, we have mapped only a fraction of the ocean floor with any real precision, leaving vast regions essentially unknown to us, and the Mariana Trench represents the most extreme version of this gap between our curiosity and our capability, a reminder that Earth still holds miles. Beneath the relatively accessible outer layers of our planet lies a realm so profoundly isolated from human experience that it exists almost entirely in the realm of theoretical understanding and mathematical inference, a place called Earth's inner core, where temperatures rival the surface of the sun and pressures compress matter into states we can barely comprehend or replicate. The inner core is a solid sphere approximately 1,300 kilometers in diameter, composed primarily of iron and nickel, sitting at the very center of our world roughly 6,370 kilometers beneath our feet, surrounded by the liquid outer core which itself is wrapped in the mantle, and then the crust upon which we live our entire lives. We know of this place not through direct observation or physical exploration, which remains eternally impossible for human beings, but rather through the study of seismic waves generated by earthquakes, waves that travel through the planet's body and reveal its internal structure through their speed and behavior, much like sound waves bouncing through darkness to paint a picture of what lies beyond our sight. The psychological mechanism that keeps us accepting this impossible boundary is the sheer logical necessity of it, the straightforward physics that makes descent impossible, where pressures would crush any vessel we could construct, and where temperatures would transform materials into states unrecognizable to us. And yet we have grown so accustomed to this fundamental limit that we rarely pause to consider the strange reality that we inhabit only the thinnest skin of our own world. We have mapped Mars, landed rovers on asteroids, and sent probes to the edge of our solar system, achievements that feel remarkable and worth celebrating, and yet the 99.9% of our planet that lies below remains eternally sealed away from us, a mystery that persists not through secrecy or obstruction. Deep beneath the concrete and steel structures of Chernobyl's Reactor Number 4 lies a mass of molten nuclear fuel that remains fundamentally unknowable to human exploration, a dense concentration of radioactive material that cooled into a formation roughly the size of an elephant, which scientists have termed the corium or lava-like fuel mass that flowed downward through the reactor's internal structures in the hours and days following the catastrophic explosion of April 26, 1986. This material exists in a state of perpetual isolation, shielded by multiple layers of protective concrete and steel that were hastily constructed to contain the unprecedented disaster, creating a barrier so effective and so heavy that no human being has ever directly observed the reactor core's interior since the moment of failure. And no human being could possibly enter such an environment without receiving lethal doses of radiation within minutes or even seconds, depending on proximity. The mechanism that keeps this location permanently sealed relates fundamentally to the nature of ionizing radiation itself, which, unlike visible threats that the human sensory apparatus evolved to detect and avoid, operates invisibly and silently, penetrating through flesh and bone to damage the cellular structures at the most fundamental genetic level, making it genuinely impossible for human consciousness to perceive the danger even as it accumulates and becomes fatal. What persists as remarkable is how this invisible threat has paradoxically become one of the most psychologically potent symbols of human vulnerability and technological overreach. Despite the fact that the radiation itself cannot be witnessed or directly experienced by any observer who would live to report their findings, and thus the reactor core remains suspended in a strange liminal space, where it simultaneously represents both absolute human inability to explore and an beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, kilometers below the frozen surface, lies an entirely hidden world of liquid water trapped in vast subglacial lakes that have remained sealed off from the atmosphere for millions of years, creating environments so isolated and extreme that they represent some of the most inaccessible places on Earth that humans have yet attempted to explore. These lakes, such as Lake Vostok, one of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet, exist in perpetual darkness under pressures that would crush most surface organisms, where temperatures hover near the freezing point maintained by geothermal heat from below and the insulating weight of ice above, and where the water itself may contain unique microbial life that has evolved in complete separation from all other terrestrial ecosystems. The psychological draw to reach these lakes stems from humanity's fundamental compulsion to explore and catalog every environment on our planet, the belief that complete knowledge requires physical access and direct observation, the romantic notion that discovering pristine ecosystems, untouched by human contact, represents a form of scientific triumph and understanding. Yet we persist in attempts to drill through kilometers of ice to reach these spaces despite the enormous technological challenges, the extreme costs involved, the risk of contaminating these isolated environments, and the practical reality that we might learn more by studying the ice itself and the chemical signatures it contains than by disturbing the ancient waters below, suggesting that our drive to physically reach these places operates almost independently of rational justification. Driven instead by an almost mythological need to stand at the edge of the unknown and claim dominion over it. Deep beneath the limestone mountains of Abkhazia in the Caucasus region lies Krubera Cave, a massive subterranean system that descends more than 2,000 meters into absolute darkness, making it one of the deepest caves ever discovered by human exploration. The cave exists as a vertical labyrinth of chambers, shafts, and passages that have been carved over millions of years by water flowing through soluble rock, creating an environment so remote and hostile that fewer people have reached its deepest points than have stood on the surface of the moon. The temperature within these depths remains consistently cold, hovering just above freezing, while the air becomes increasingly thin and difficult to breathe as one descends further down, and the psychological weight of knowing that thousands of meters of solid earth separate you from the surface creates a suffocating pressure that affects even the most experienced cave divers and explorers. The mechanism that makes Krubera so impossibly challenging lies in the combination of extreme depth, narrow passages that require contortionists to navigate, underground lakes that demand technical diving skills, and the genuine possibility of getting lost in a maze where rescue would be virtually impossible, and where the human body begins to deteriorate under such extreme conditions. What makes this place particularly fascinating is that despite all logical reasoning suggesting that no human should ever venture into such a place, despite the real risks of death, despite the complete absence of any practical benefit or discovery worth the danger, explorers continue to push deeper into Krubera, driven by something beyond rational thought, some fundamental human compulsion to go further, to reach lower, to touch the absolute limits of what the human body can endure. And we have normalized this pursuit of knowledge through suffering, celebrating these descents as achievements rather than questioning why we flee. North Sentinel Island exists as perhaps the last truly forbidden territory on Earth, a small landmass in the Indian Ocean belonging to the Andaman Islands, where an indigenous population known as the Sentinels have maintained complete isolation from the outside world for thousands of years, their existence known to us primarily through brief, hostile encounters and the few photographs captured from a distance that reveal almost nothing about their actual lives or intentions. The Indian government has officially prohibited all contact with the island since 1956, establishing a buffer zone that extends far beyond its shores, and this legal barrier is enforced not out of mere bureaucratic caution, but because every attempt at contact over the past several decades has been met with arrows, violence, and a clear, unmistakable message that outsiders are not welcome under any circumstance. What makes North Sentinel Island psychologically fascinating is how it represents the complete inversion of modern human experience, a place where we have chosen collective ignorance not from lack of technology or capability, but from a reasoned understanding that some encounters should not be forced, that the right to remain unknown and untouched might supersede our insatiable curiosity about every corner of existence. The mechanisms that protect this isolation are rooted in respect for autonomy and a recognition of historical trauma, acknowledging that indigenous populations have suffered tremendously when discovered by outsiders. And yet what persists despite this logical framework is a strange cultural obsession with the island itself, a morbid fascination that treats it as a mystery to be solved rather than a boundary to be honored. A persistent human impulse to document and understand everything that somehow coexists peacefully alongside our stated commitment to leaving them alone. Deep within the northeastern corner of Ethiopia lies one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, a vast depression that sinks nearly 500 feet below sea level, creating a landscape so alien and hostile that it remains almost entirely unexplored by human civilization. The Danakil Depression is a place where the very ground beneath your feet seems designed by nature to prevent your survival, where temperatures regularly exceed 125 degrees Fahrenheit and can reach even higher during the day, where the air itself carries toxic volcanic gases that would fill your lungs with each breath, and where the earth constantly shifts and transforms as if alive with its own terrible purpose. The terrain consists of vast salt flats, sulfurous hot springs that paint the ground in impossible colors of yellow and orange, and volcanic formations that release poisonous fumes continuously into the atmosphere, all while the region experiences virtually no rainfall, leaving it drier than most deserts on the planet. What makes the Danakil Depression truly impossible to explore is the combination of these factors working in concert, each one amplifying the danger of the others, creating a place where the human body cannot adapt because the conditions exceed what human physiology can tolerate for extended periods. The psychological mechanism that keeps most explorers away is rooted in our deep evolutionary fear of environments where multiple survival systems are simultaneously threatened, where you cannot drink the water, cannot breathe the air safely, cannot rely on your body's cooling mechanisms, and cannot see far enough to navigate safely. Yet despite these absolute barriers to exploration and the complete lack of any logical reason to venture into this place, the Danakil Depression has somehow become a destination that a small number of extremely determined and well-equipped adventurers attempt to visit each year, suggesting that humanity. Nestled in the Atlantic Ocean approximately 22 miles off the coast of São Paulo, Brazil, lies Ilha de Queimada Grande, commonly known as Snake Island, a place so inherently dangerous that the Brazilian government has declared it completely off-limits to the general public, with only the most essential scientific expeditions permitted to set foot upon its shores under extraordinary circumstances and with extensive protective equipment. The island, which spans merely 4.5 acres, is home to an estimated 4,000 golden lancehead pit vipers, making it arguably the most densely concentrated population of venomous snakes in the entire world, with some estimates suggesting there is one snake for every square meter of land. A ratio so extreme that stepping anywhere on the island without the most careful deliberation would likely result in immediate contact with a highly venomous reptile capable of delivering a lethal bite. These snakes, which are endemic to this island and found nowhere else on Earth, possess venom so potent that it is reported to be 5 times stronger than that of their mainland counterparts, having evolved in isolation over thousands of years to become perfectly adapted predators within their confined ecosystem, where seabirds represent their primary food source, and where the absence of terrestrial competitors has allowed them to develop an almost unparalleled level of toxicity. The psychological mechanism driving our fear and fascination with Snake Island operates on a fundamental level of human instinct, as the combination of isolation, density, venom potency, and complete inaccessibility triggers our deepest anxieties about hostile environments and the limits of human dominion over nature itself, creating a place that feels almost mythological in its remoteness and danger. Deep within the borders of Ukraine lies a region so contaminated, so fundamentally altered by human catastrophe, that entire towns have been swallowed by nature and time, their streets now walked only by animals who have adapted to radiation levels that would be instantly lethal to most humans. The zone of alienation, stretching across roughly 1,900 square kilometers surrounding the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, represents one of the most forbidden and inaccessible places on Earth, a landscape frozen in the moment of April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 experienced a catastrophic failure that released more radioactive material into the atmosphere than the combined output of every nuclear weapon ever detonated. The immediate evacuation created a perimeter that remains largely impenetrable even today, more than 3 decades later, with radiation hotspots scattered throughout the terrain in patterns that follow neither logic nor geography, making even trained scientists unable to predict where the invisible danger might concentrate at lethal levels. The psychological barrier surrounding the zone extends far beyond the physical danger itself, as the very concept of a place rendered permanently uninhabitable by human error creates a deep existential discomfort, a tangible reminder of our capacity for irreversible harm on a scale that our minds struggle to fully process. What makes the zone of alienation particularly fascinating is how we have come to accept its existence as simply another feature of our world, how news coverage has faded into academic discussion, how the abstract number of affected people has transformed into historical tragedy rather than ongoing human impact. The exclusion zone persists not merely because radiation remains dangerous, but because acknowledging the full scope of what happened and the permanence of what was lost forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about industrial society. Deep beneath the surface of eastern Romania lies a cave system that exists in a state of complete isolation from the outside world, a place so utterly sealed from ordinary atmospheric conditions that it has developed its own independent ecosystem, operating under entirely different chemical and biological principles than anything we might encounter in our normal exploration of Earth. Movile Cave was discovered in 1986 by a construction worker who broke through a concrete wall during renovation work, immediately finding himself at the entrance to a subterranean world that had been hermetically sealed for approximately 5.5 million years, creating conditions so unique and so fundamentally alien that scientists have compared entering this cave to exploring extraterrestrial environments without ever leaving our own planet. The cave system maintains a constant temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit and is filled with an atmosphere that contains significantly elevated levels of carbon dioxide and hydrogen sulfide, gases that would render it immediately lethal to unprotected human exploration, creating a poisonous environment that actively prevents casual visitation or scientific study beyond the most carefully controlled expeditions involving protective equipment and rigorous safety protocols. What makes Movile Cave genuinely incomprehensible to our normal understanding of life is the presence of an entirely self-contained biosphere, organisms that have evolved in complete darkness for millions of years without any input from surface ecosystems, bacteria and fungi and strange eyeless creatures that derive their energy from chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis, creating a chain of life that operates on principles we still fundamentally struggle to fully understand. Imagine descending through absolute darkness into the deepest trenches of the ocean, where the water pressure would crush your body instantaneously, where sunlight has never reached and will never reach, where temperatures plummet to just above freezing, and then suddenly you encounter something impossible. Jets of superheated water shooting upward from the Earth's crust at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, creating towering chimneys of mineral deposits that look like alien structures from another world entirely. These are hydrothermal vents, among the most extreme and inaccessible environments on our planet, existing at depths typically between 2 and 4 kilometers below the ocean's surface, scattered along the mid-ocean ridges that snake through our seas like the seams of a baseball. The vents themselves are formed by the constant interaction between seawater and magma chambers beneath the seafloor, creating a continuous cycle where cold ocean water seeps down through cracks in the earth, gets heated by the planet's internal furnace, and explodes back out laden with minerals and chemicals that precipitate and build these remarkable structures over time. What makes these places so difficult to explore is not merely their depth or the crushing pressure or the extreme temperatures, but the sheer remoteness and the hostile chemistry of the environment, where the water around the vents contains hydrogen sulfide and other toxic compounds that would be immediately lethal to unprotected human tissue. Yet despite these seemingly insurmountable barriers, human curiosity persists in wanting to venture into these spaces, perhaps because they represent something so fundamentally alien and untouched that they feel like gateways to understanding the very origins of life itself on Earth. Beneath nearly 2.5 miles of Antarctic ice lies Lake Vostok, a freshwater lake so isolated and untouched that it has remained sealed off from the surface world for approximately 15 million years, making it one of the most inaccessible bodies of water on the entire planet. The lake itself spans an area roughly equivalent to Lake Ontario, containing water that has been completely isolated beneath the ice sheet, cut off from sunlight, air, and any external environmental influence for longer than human civilization has existed. Scientists have detected this subglacial lake through radio echo sounding and satellite measurements, revealing a vast underwater ecosystem that exists in complete darkness, subject to extreme pressure and near-freezing temperatures, yet somehow still harbors the potential for microbial life that evolved under conditions entirely alien to surface biology. The psychological weight of knowing such a place exists creates a peculiar tension within human consciousness, because we understand intellectually that life persists in isolation, yet we struggle to conceptualize what organisms might exist in such absolute environmental extremes, what they might look like, and how fundamentally different they would be from any life we have ever encountered. The barrier preventing exploration is not merely physical but philosophical, because drilling into Lake Vostok risks contaminating the pristine environment with surface microorganisms, destroying the very scientific value that makes exploration desirable in the first place, creating a paradox where understanding demands destruction. We have normalized this paradox through rational compromise, accepting that some places must remain unexplored not out of inability, but out of ethical necessity, a concept that challenges our traditional drive toward discovery and suggests that perhaps the greatest human achievement is sometimes knowing which boundaries we should not cross. Surtsey Island emerged from the North Atlantic Ocean in 1963 when an underwater volcanic eruption broke the surface near Iceland, creating a brand new landmass that did not exist before that moment. And within just a few years, this island grew to cover more than 2 square kilometers of volcanic rock and ash, yet despite its dramatic and violent birth into existence, it remains one of the most heavily protected and restricted locations on our entire planet, where human visitation is almost completely forbidden, and the few researchers who do manage to access its shores must undergo extensive permits and rigorous protocols to ensure their presence causes absolutely no disturbance to the fragile ecosystems that have begun to establish themselves there. The psychological mechanism behind this extreme protection stems from a deeply compelling scientific rationale. Surtsey represents a unique opportunity to observe how life itself colonizes a completely barren landscape, how plants arrive on wind currents, how insects establish themselves, how birds nest on untouched volcanic rock, and how entire ecosystems build themselves from absolute nothingness in real time, making it an invaluable laboratory that simply cannot be replicated or recreated anywhere else on Earth. And researchers understand that even footprints left by human visitors could disturb the delicate pioneering species that are gradually transforming black volcanic stone into living soil. Yet despite this clear scientific logic and the genuine irreplaceability of Surtsey's research value, the island has become something almost mystical in human imagination. A place that feels forbidden precisely because it is forbidden, that seems more wondrous because we cannot touch it, that has normalized the idea that some places on our planet deserve to exist entirely separate from human presence, untouched by our hands and unmarked by our footprints. As if the very act of keeping ourselves away. Deep within the limestone mountains of central Vietnam lies Sun Dune Cave, a massive underground chamber so vast that it contains its own river, jungle, and climate system. Yet even after its discovery in 1991, large portions of this subterranean world remain completely unmapped and inaccessible to human exploration. The cave stretches for nearly 5 miles in length, with passages that descend into darkness so profound that conventional light sources barely penetrate the void, and sections exist beyond the known entrance routes, where the cave system branches into unmeasured tunnels and chambers that have never felt the presence of human footsteps or equipment. The psychological draw of Sun Dune's unexplored depths operates on a fundamental human curiosity about absolute boundaries and the last remaining truly unknown spaces on our planet, creating an almost mythological appeal to the few expedition teams who venture into the known passages and occasionally glimpse the entrances to deeper sections that remain forbidden or simply too dangerous to navigate. We have normalized the existence of these inaccessible passages by treating them as natural obstacles rather than genuine mysteries, accepting that some caves are simply too structurally unstable, too flooded, or too geometrically complex for human bodies and current equipment to survive passage. Yet this rationalization masks a deeper truth. We have largely surrendered to the idea that certain earthly spaces will forever remain beyond our reach, and we have made peace with this limitation by converting it into ecotourism and measured exploration rather than pursuing the comprehensive mapping that characterized previous centuries of geographic conquest. The unexplored passages of Sun Dung persist in their mystery, not because we lack the theoretical capability to eventually map them, but because we have collectively decided that the cave's integrity and its own isolated ecosystem. Deep beneath the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan lies one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, a location so hazardous that human exploration remains virtually impossible even more than a decade after the catastrophic tsunami of March 11, 2011, triggered the facility's meltdown. Within the reactor containment vessels, the nuclear fuel has melted through its protective barriers and pooled somewhere within the lower levels of the structure, creating a mass of extremely radioactive material whose exact location and current state remain largely unknown, shrouded in darkness and intense radiation that defeats our most advanced robotic reconnaissance equipment. The temperatures in these spaces exceed what our instruments can safely endure, the radiation levels so potent that any prolonged human presence would prove fatal within minutes, and the structural instability of the damaged reactors means that accessing these depths requires an extraordinary convergence of technological capability, protective innovation, and acceptance of profound risk. What makes the melted cores psychologically fascinating is how they represent a fundamental limit to human knowledge and control, a place where our technological mastery breaks down entirely, where we have built something so complex and dangerous that we can no longer fully understand or inspect what we have created. We have constructed elaborate narratives around this place, developing unmanned robots with cutting-edge sensors and remote operation systems. Yet even our most sophisticated machines return with fragmented data and incomplete pictures, leaving the reality of the melted cores partially hidden from view. This technological gap has become normalized in our collective consciousness, transformed from a shocking failure into simply another fact of our post-industrial world, a reminder that certain places will remain forever sealed off, eternally explored but never. Devon Island, located in the Canadian Arctic archipelago, stands as one of the most remote and inhospitable landmasses on Earth, a place where the combination of extreme cold, harsh weather conditions, and geographic isolation has created an environment so severe that human exploration remains fundamentally limited and dangerous. The island spans approximately 55,000 square kilometers, making it the largest uninhabited island in the world, yet despite its massive size, fewer than a dozen research stations exist on its surface, and the vast majority of its interior remains completely unexplored by human beings. The temperatures regularly plunge to negative 40 degrees Celsius during winter months, while the terrain consists of barren tundra, jagged rock formations, and ancient glaciers that shift and crack unpredictably, creating crevasses that can swallow entire expeditions without warning. The reason Devon Island remains so resistant to human exploration lies fundamentally in the basic mathematics of survival and energy expenditure, where every additional kilometer traveled into the island's interior requires exponentially more resources, food, fuel, and equipment than the human body can reasonably carry or cache. The Arctic environment operates on principles that punish hesitation and reward only those with perfect preparation and absolute precision, meaning that even small mistakes in navigation or equipment maintenance can transform a scientific expedition into a life or death struggle within hours. What makes Devon Island particularly fascinating is how we have collectively accepted its status as permanently beyond the reach of casual exploration, treating it almost as a de facto forbidden zone not through any official prohibition, but through the simple recognition that the cost of failure there is absolute and irreversible. Imagine descending through absolute darkness for nearly 2 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean, where the pressure becomes so intense that it would crush an unprotected human body instantaneously, until finally you reach a landscape that few humans have ever witnessed and fewer still could ever survive to document in person. The mid-Atlantic ridge floor exists as a geological seam running down the center of the Atlantic, a massive underwater mountain range that stretches for over 10,000 miles, marking the boundary where two tectonic plates slowly drift apart at a rate of roughly 2 centimeters per year. Here, molten rock from deep within the Earth's mantle emerges through cracks and fissures, creating new oceanic crust in an endless process of planetary creation that has been occurring continuously for millions of years, generating heat so extreme that the water surrounding these hydrothermal vents reaches temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit while remaining liquid due to the crushing pressure from the water column above. The reason humans cannot explore this realm with any regularity or comfort stems from the fundamental incompatibility between human physiology and this extreme environment. Our bodies require breathable air, moderate pressure, and temperatures within a narrow range, none of which exist at these depths. Submersibles designed specifically for such expeditions are extraordinarily rare and expensive, limited in their operational time, and capable of carrying only a handful of people at most during brief visits that last mere hours before the vessels must return to the surface. Despite possessing the theoretical technological capability to reach these locations, we have somehow normalized the fact that vast regions of our own planet remain effectively unexplored and unknowable to human experience, treating this profound limitation as simply the way things are rather than as a genuine M. In the heart of the Karakum Desert in Turkmenistan lies a circular void roughly 70 meters in diameter and 30 meters deep, perpetually burning with an ethereal orange flame that has consumed natural gas continuously for more than 5 decades without cessation or explanation. The crater itself was formed in 1971 when Soviet engineers drilling for natural gas accidentally punctured a massive underground cavern filled with methane, causing the ground to collapse into a sudden chasm. And rather than attempting the costly and dangerous task of sealing the rupture, they made a decision that would echo through time. They simply ignited the escaping gas to burn it away safely, assuming it would consume within days or perhaps weeks at most. What followed instead was an unexpected permanence, as the fires of Darvaza have continued burning continuously through every season, every geopolitical shift, every technological advancement, and every attempt at extinguishment, creating a phenomenon so visually striking that locals eventually named it the Gates of Hell, and tourists began traveling vast distances across one of Earth's most inhospitable landscapes simply to witness it. The psychological mechanism behind our fixation on this place resides in its fundamental contradiction. Here is a crater that should not be burning, existing in a location that should not be hospitable to human visitation, maintained by a gas reserve that should have depleted long ago, representing an error in judgment that somehow transformed into permanence through sheer negligence and then deliberate preservation. We have normalized this burning chasm as a landmark worth protecting and visiting despite its origins in industrial accident, despite its dangerous gases and unstable edges, despite the knowledge that it serves no practical purpose and could be sealed at any time with sufficient resources and effort. Deep beneath the surface of the western Pacific Ocean, nearly 7 miles down in the Mariana Trench, exists a place so remote and so hostile that the walls themselves remain almost entirely unexplored by human presence, a frontier that makes the moon seem accessible by comparison. The Challenger Deep represents the lowest point in Earth's oceans, a location where the pressure exceeds 1,000 times that of sea level, where temperatures hover just above freezing, and where darkness is so complete that it exists beyond the comprehension of creatures evolved in sunlight. The walls surrounding this abyss descend into geological formations that have been shaped over millions of years by tectonic forces, yet we know almost nothing about their composition, their microbial ecosystems, or the countless organisms that might call these crushing depths their home. Only a handful of human-crewed expeditions have ever reached the very bottom, and those journeys lasted merely minutes, with instruments unable to fully document the walls themselves before the extreme environment forced retreat to the surface world. The psychological mechanism that keeps us from exploring these walls operates on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the sheer impossibility of sustained human presence at such depths, which creates a barrier that feels almost spiritual in its absoluteness. We have normalized this unreachable quality by accepting it as an inescapable fact of physics and biology, yet we continue to orbit planets and robots across Mars despite the Challenger deep walls remaining virtually untouched, an irony that persists because the ocean deep demands something we cannot provide. The ability to survive without our machines failing, without our bodies collapsing under unimaginable pressure, without returning to depths that seem to actively reject the very concept of exploration itself. Deep within the Arabian Peninsula lies one of Earth's most formidable and least explored regions, a vast expanse of sand and desolation known as the Empty Quarter, or Rub al-Khali in Arabic, a name that translates quite literally to mean the place where nothing exists. This desert stretches across approximately 250,000 square kilometers, spanning the borders of Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, and the United Arab Emirates, creating a landscape so hostile and unforgiving that it remains one of the planet's greatest barriers to human exploration and settlement. The temperatures here can exceed 50 degrees Celsius during the day, while the nights plummet to near freezing, creating thermal extremes that test the limits of human physiology and endurance. The sand dunes themselves tower upward like mountains of pure desolation, some reaching heights of 300 meters or more, their slopes constantly shifting with the relentless winds that sweep across this forsaken terrain. The psychological mechanism that keeps this region unexplored is rooted in the simple calculus of survival, where the human body becomes a fragile instrument subjected to overwhelming environmental forces that offer no mercy and no margin for error. A person stranded here would face dehydration within hours, their body's water reserves depleting at an accelerated rate due to the extreme heat and aridity, while the vast distances between any conceivable rescue or water source render traditional navigation methods virtually useless. Yet despite having modern technology including satellite imagery, GPS systems, and advanced communication devices that could theoretically allow for safer exploration, the Empty Quarter remains largely unmapped and unknown, a testament to how we have collectively decided that some places on Earth simply do not warrant the investment of human effort and risk required to fully understand them. Deep within the remote Danakil Depression of northern Ethiopia lies one of Earth's most inhospitable and inaccessible natural phenomena, a place where the ground itself seems to breathe with molten fury. Erda Ale, whose name means smoking mountain in the Afar language, contains what is believed to be the world's only permanent lava lake, a roiling body of liquid basalt that has maintained its existence for over a century, continuously churning and bubbling beneath the crater rim at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The lake itself spans an area roughly the size of several football fields, and its surface is never still, constantly convulsing with hypnotic waves of incandescent rock that rise and fall in patterns that seem almost rhythmic, almost alive in their persistence. The volcanic crater sits at an elevation of over 600 meters above the surrounding depression, and the approach itself requires traversing one of the hottest, most chemically toxic landscapes on the planet, where sulfurous gases poison the air and geothermal activity has created a landscape that resembles another world entirely. The psychological draw of Erda Ale speaks to humanity's deep fascination with witnessing creation itself, with standing at the threshold between the solid world we know and the molten interior that lurks perpetually beneath our feet, a primal confrontation with the raw, indifferent power of our planet's geology. Yet we have somehow normalized the extreme danger inherent in attempting to reach this place, accepting the risks of dehydration, toxic gas inhalation, altitude sickness, and sudden volcanic activity as acceptable prices for the opportunity to peer into an active lava lake, as though this fundamental drive to witness the Earth's most violent moments overrides our basic survival instincts and logical self-preservation, pulling explorers and researchers toward Erda Ale despite all rational warnings. Deep within the Pacific Ocean lies a location so remote, so isolated from any form of human civilization, that it exists in a state of absolute solitude that defies comprehension. Point Nemo, officially known as the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, sits approximately 894 kilometers away from the nearest land in any direction, making it the most distant point from human habitation on the entire planet. This underwater realm exists beneath waters so vast and so deep that even our most advanced submarines and research vessels rarely venture into its vicinity, leaving it in a state of permanent human absence that seems almost unnatural to our collective understanding. The surrounding ocean stretches endlessly in every direction, with no islands, no atolls, and no continental shelves breaking the monotony of the water's surface or the depths below. This geographic isolation creates a psychological barrier in the human mind because we are fundamentally creatures of exploration and discovery, yet Point Nemo represents the ultimate frontier of human limitation. Our inability to consistently explore and study this location stems not from technological failure, but from economic inefficiency, as the cost of reaching and maintaining a research presence at such an extreme distance far outweighs any scientific benefit we might derive. The human mind processes this remoteness through a peculiar mechanism of acceptance and indifference. We have normalized the existence of places on our own world that remain virtually untouched by human eyes, allowing these spaces to exist in our collective consciousness as theoretical locations rather than tangible environments. Point Nemo persists as a symbol of human boundaries not because we lack the capability to reach it, but because we have collectively decided that the vast majority of resources should be directed elsewhere, effectively creating an invisible fence around this oceanic expanse. Beneath the surface of Greenland's vast ice sheet, at depths that can exceed 3,000 meters, lies a hidden world of subglacial lakes and ancient bedrock that remains almost entirely inaccessible to human exploration. A realm so isolated and extreme that only the most specialized drilling operations have managed to pierce through the compressed ice to touch what lies below. The Greenland ice sheet covers an area roughly equivalent to the entire United Kingdom, yet our knowledge of the terrain and geological structures hidden directly underneath this frozen expanse remains fragmentary and incomplete, limited primarily to remote sensing data and the occasional borehole drilling project that requires years of preparation and millions of dollars in funding. The conditions at the base of the ice sheet present multiple layers of obstacles. The crushing pressure from miles of ice above compacts the snow into crystalline structures of increasing density. The temperatures remain far below freezing even at the base due to the insulating properties of the ice itself, and the bedrock beneath may be covered in a thin layer of water created by friction and geothermal heat, a subglacial environment that is utterly hostile to sustained human presence. We understand the fundamental reason why these regions resist exploration. They are genuinely dangerous, requiring extraordinary technical achievement to access at all, and the physical barriers are not merely difficult but scientifically legitimate obstacles that justify our inability to fully survey these spaces. Yet what persists is our collective acceptance that these depths can simply remain unmapped, that an entire continent's subsurface can be essentially unknown despite our advanced technological capabilities, and that we have normalized the existence of vast terrestrial regions where human knowledge remains superficial and incomplete, as though some places are simply meant to exist beyond T. Deep within the island of Borneo, hidden beneath layers of limestone and jungle canopy in the Malaysian state of Sarawak, exists a void so massive that it defies immediate comprehension. The Sarawak Chamber, a cathedral of stone and darkness that remains largely unexplored despite its discovery in 1981. This enormous cave chamber stretches approximately 700 meters in length, 430 meters in width, and rises to heights exceeding 110 meters at its greatest point, creating an internal space so vast that it could comfortably contain 40 Boeing 747 aircraft or several city blocks of urban architecture, yet remains almost entirely unknown to the wider world. The chamber exists in a state of perpetual darkness where sunlight has never penetrated, where the air grows heavier with moisture and minerals, and where the temperature holds steady at a constant cool that never varies with the seasons above. The depths of this chamber have been touched by only a handful of experienced cavers and scientific expeditions, making it one of the least explored large enclosed spaces that humans have ever discovered, despite possessing dimensions that rival some of the world's largest underground cathedrals and concert halls. What makes the Sarawak Chamber psychologically significant is precisely this disconnect. It is an achievement of human discovery, yet remains functionally invisible to human experience. A place we have found but have not truly explored or inhabited, existing in that peculiar category of known unknowns where we acknowledge something exists but cannot bring ourselves to fully penetrate its mysteries. The psychological mechanism at work involves our relationship with scale and accessibility. A cave this size should naturally draw expeditions and study, yet the practical difficulties of access, the extreme conditions, the logistical challenges of moving through absolute darkness with many. Nestled within the Antarctic continent lies a region so inhospitable, so devoid of the basic conditions necessary for life as we understand it, that scientists have long considered it one of the most extreme environments on Earth, a place where the human body cannot survive for extended periods without specialized equipment and constant monitoring. The Antarctic Dry Valleys stretch across approximately 2,000 square miles of the Ross Dependency, representing the largest ice-free area on the Antarctic continent. Yet paradoxically, this absence of ice makes the region even more forbidding rather than more welcoming. The valleys experience wind speeds that regularly exceed 100 miles per hour, temperatures that plunge to minus 110 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, and humidity levels so remarkably low that the few microorganisms that have adapted to exist there are considered among the most resilient life forms known to science. The soil itself is so desiccated, so completely drained of moisture through a process of sublimation where ice transforms directly into water vapor in the thin, cold air, that the ground becomes a frozen, incomprehensibly barren landscape that resembles the surface of Mars more closely than it resembles any terrestrial ecosystem. Yet humans continue to venture into these valleys, driven by an almost compulsive need to understand the absolute limits of habitability, to conduct research on how life persists in the absence of nearly every condition we associate with survival, and to document the mechanisms by which even the most primitive organisms maintain their existence in a realm of perpetual, unforgiving extremity. We persist in exploring this place despite knowing that our presence there is fundamentally unnatural, that every breath requires heated air, that every step requires advanced protective gear, and that the moment our technology fails, the valley will claim us with indifferent absolute. Descending through the water column toward the Java Trench, one encounters a place so remote and so profoundly isolated that fewer human beings have witnessed it than have traveled to outer space, a fact that strikes with peculiar force when one considers how thoroughly we believe we have mapped and understood our own planet. The Java Trench, also known as the Sunda Strait Trench, reaches depths approaching 7,000 meters in some sections, creating a submarine canyon where the pressure becomes so immense that the human body would be compressed to a fraction of its normal volume in mere seconds, where the darkness is absolute and perpetual, broken only by the bioluminescent displays of creatures that have never known sunlight and perhaps cannot even conceive of its existence. The floor of this trench presents a landscape of geological drama and biological mystery, where the Earth's crust is being actively subducted, where tectonic forces operate in silence on scales that dwarf human comprehension, and where the sediment accumulates in layers that tell stories of millions of years of planetary change. Yet despite possessing the technological capability to send rovers to distant planets and to maintain permanent stations in orbit around Earth, we have explored less than 5% of our own ocean floors, and the Java Trench remains largely unknown except through remote sensing and the occasional research expedition that manages to approach its mysteries. The psychological mechanism underlying this paradox is fundamentally one of distance and indifference, for the ocean depths do not threaten us immediately in the way that space exploration does, and we have unconsciously accepted that certain regions of our world will remain forever beyond our reach, that the frontier beneath the waves will remain open and unconquered, a kind of terra incognita that persists not because of technical impossibility, but because of the sheer expense and effort. Deep within the Kamchatka Peninsula of far eastern Russia lies one of Earth's most inaccessible volcanic interiors, a landscape so remote and hostile that even seasoned volcanologists approach it with profound caution and meticulous planning. The region contains 29 active volcanoes, including Klyushevskaya Sopka, one of the world's most continuously active volcanoes, surrounded by vast calderas, lava fields, and geothermal zones that shift and change with each passing season, making any permanent mapping or long-term study fundamentally impossible. The interior remains largely unexplored not because of any single barrier, but because of the convergence of multiple insurmountable challenges that create a self-reinforcing wall of impossibility around these volcanic systems. Extreme weather conditions sweep across the peninsula with little warning, temperatures plummet to dangerous extremes, and the infrastructure required to support human exploration simply does not and cannot exist in these remote coordinates. The psychological mechanism that sustains this exploration barrier is our collective acceptance that certain places on Earth are simply too expensive and too dangerous to know completely, and we have normalized this ignorance by treating it as inevitable rather than by continuing to push against it. We tell ourselves that we have sufficient satellite imagery and occasional research expeditions to understand these volcanoes adequately, and we allow ourselves to believe that this distant knowledge is equivalent to true exploration, when in reality vast portions of the Kamchatka volcanic interior remain fundamentally unknown to human experience, visited only by wildlife and shaped by geological processes that operate entirely beyond our observation or comprehension. Deep within the volcanic landscape of Cameroon in West Africa lies a crater lake of deceptive serenity, a body of water so chemically unstable and laden with invisible danger that it remains among the most forbidden places on Earth for human exploration, a place where the very act of descending into its depths could trigger a catastrophic release of carbon dioxide gas that would suffocate everything in its path for miles around. Lake Nyos sits in a crater formed by volcanic activity thousands of years ago, and as rainwater accumulated within this depression, it began to interact with mineral-rich volcanic rock beneath the surface, a process that allowed carbon dioxide to seep slowly and continuously from the Earth's crust into the water column, where it became trapped and dissolved under pressure in the deepest layers of the lake. The lake itself appears calm and almost inviting from the surface, its waters reflecting the sky with a quiet beauty that belies the accumulation of approximately 80 million tons of carbon dioxide gas trapped within its depths, a quantity so vast and unstable that any significant disturbance could trigger a sudden overturn of the water layers, releasing all that dissolved gas into the atmosphere in what scientists call a limnic eruption. The mechanism that creates this danger is rooted in the principles of water density and gas solubility. As carbon dioxide accumulates in the bottom layers where pressure is highest, the water becomes denser and heavier, creating a stable stratification that prevents mixing with the upper layers. Yet this stability is fragile and temporary, dependent entirely on the lake remaining undisturbed and on water temperatures remaining within a narrow range. In 1986, Lake Nyos demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of this instability when a limnic eruption occurred naturally, releasing a massive cloud of carbon dioxide gas that rolled down the valleys surrounding the lake. Deep within the interior of Namibia's skeleton coast lies a vast and virtually unmapped wilderness that stretches across thousands of square kilometers, a place where the Namib Desert meets ancient rocky plateaus and where human presence has become increasingly sparse over the past century. This region earned its haunting name from the countless shipwrecks that litter its Atlantic shoreline, vessels that foundered on hidden rocks and sandbars throughout the colonial era, yet the true interior remains largely unexplored not because of the wrecks themselves, but because of the extreme confluence of environmental factors that make sustained human penetration nearly impossible. The area experiences temperatures that swing from scorching heat during the day to near-freezing conditions at night, vast salt pans that stretch endlessly without variation, shifting sand dunes that bury landmarks and render navigation treacherous, and an almost complete absence of freshwater sources that forces any explorer to carry supplies weighing dozens of kilograms across terrain that offers no mercy to the unprepared. The psychological mechanism that keeps this region isolated operates on a fundamental level of human risk assessment, where the cost of exploration dramatically outweighs any potential reward, creating a logical barrier that few expeditions have deemed worth crossing, and those that have attempted such journeys have returned with fragmented data and incomplete maps. What persists despite having no commercial value, no mineral wealth of note, and no strategic importance is simply the fact that we have accepted the skeleton coast interior as a place that need not be fully known, a final frontier within our own world that we have implicitly agreed requires no comprehensive documentation, allowing it to remain one of Earth's last truly alien landscapes where human curiosity has met its match against the indifference of nature itself. Nestled along the border between Bhutan and Tibet, Gangkhar Puensum stands as the world's highest unclimbed mountain, reaching an elevation of approximately 7,395 meters, and it remains one of the most restricted peaks on Earth due to the deliberate policies of the Bhutanese government, which has explicitly forbidden all mountaineering expeditions to its summit since the year 1994. The mountain itself presents formidable technical challenges with unpredictable weather patterns, unstable rock formations, and avalanche-prone slopes that make ascent extraordinarily dangerous. Yet the primary barrier to exploration is not the mountain's inherent difficulty, but rather the conscious decision by Bhutanese authorities to preserve the peak as sacred and inviolate. This restriction emerged from a deep cultural and spiritual philosophy that views certain mountains as the dwelling places of deities and protective spirits, and the government determined that allowing commercial expeditions and the inevitable environmental degradation would constitute a desecration of these sacred spaces. What makes Gankar Puensum psychologically fascinating is how it represents a deliberate inversion of modern mountaineering culture, which typically celebrates the conquest and conquest of peaks as achievements worthy of international recognition and prestige. Yet Bhutan's approach instead valorizes restraint and spiritual reverence over human ambition. The mountain persists in its unclimbed state despite having no logical reason to remain so from a purely physical perspective, as climbers with the appropriate technical skills and resources could theoretically reach the summit if access were permitted, but instead the restriction endures because we have culturally normalized the idea that sacred spaces deserve protection even when we possess the capability to dominate them. Deep within the tabletop mountain of Mount Roraima, which straddles the border between Venezuela, Brazil, and Guyana in South America, lies a network of caves so vast and complex that their true extent remains unmapped and largely unexplored by modern civilization, existing as geological mysteries that have resisted systematic human documentation despite their proximity to known trekking routes and established base camps. These caverns, formed over millions of years through the dissolution of sandstone and quartzite by acidic groundwater, create a labyrinthine underground world where darkness is absolute, where the air grows thick and still, and where the weight of the mountain above creates a pressure that seems to compress time itself into something heavier and slower than what exists on the surface. The caves extend deep into the ancient Precambrian rock formations, their passages widening and narrowing unpredictably, their ceilings sometimes rising into cathedral-like chambers and sometimes descending into crawl spaces so tight that movement becomes a meditation on constraint and persistence. What makes these caves particularly resistant to exploration is not merely their physical difficulty, though they certainly possess that, but rather the psychological barrier they represent, the way they seem to exist outside the normal parameters of human spatial understanding, as if the mountain itself discourages penetration by making each passage feel simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Explorers who have ventured into the documented sections report a disorienting absence of light, where even the most powerful modern equipment seems inadequate, creating a sensory deprivation that makes distance impossible to judge and time nearly impossible to measure, all while the cave systems continue to extend into darkness in directions that no human has yet chosen or been able to follow. Beneath the Arctic tundra and the frozen expanses of Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada lies a substance that has remained largely untouched and unexplored for thousands of years. A dense matrix of soil, ice, and organic material that has been locked in a perpetual state of freezing, and this is the deep permafrost. Layers that extend hundreds of meters into the earth, where temperatures never rise above freezing, and where the very ground itself becomes an impenetrable barrier to human investigation. The deepest permafrost regions contain ice that is more than 1,000 meters thick in some locations, and beneath these layers exist preserved remains of extinct animals, ancient plant matter, and microbial communities that have existed in a state of suspended animation, untouched by human eyes or instruments. To reach these depths requires not only specialized drilling equipment and teams of experienced researchers, but also the willingness to accept that exploration here is slow, expensive, and often yields incomplete data, because the ground fights back against intrusion, refreezing around probes and creating conditions that obscure what lies below. The psychological barrier here is one of temporal distance combined with physical inaccessibility, the knowledge that we are separated from these frozen layers not just by depth and hardness, but by time itself, by geological processes that demand patience we rarely possess in our modern world. We have normalized the idea that some things simply cannot be known, that the permafrost will keep its secrets indefinitely, and we continue with our lives above these frozen tombs, rarely contemplating what waits in the darkness below, accepting this frontier of the unknowable as a natural limit to human curiosity and capability. Deep within the northwestern region of Madagascar lies a geological formation so hostile and impenetrable that it has remained largely unexplored and inaccessible to human investigation despite being discovered centuries ago. A vast landscape of razor-sharp limestone pinnacles known as Tsingy de Bemaraha, where the very ground itself becomes a weapon against those who dare to traverse it. The name itself derives from the Malagasy word meaning, where one cannot walk barefoot, a poetic understatement for a terrain composed of thousands upon thousands of jagged stone blades rising vertically from the earth like a petrified forest of knives, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, creating a labyrinthine maze of gaps, crevasses, and vertical shafts that cut through layers of ancient karst limestone weathered by millions of years of water erosion. The formation covers approximately 260 square kilometers, an area so vast and so treacherous that even with modern climbing equipment, exploration remains extraordinarily difficult and dangerous, with rescue operations practically impossible in many sections due to the extreme isolation and the unforgiving nature of the landscape itself. What makes Tsingy de Bemaraha particularly impenetrable is not merely its physical structure, but rather the psychological barrier it creates, for the sharp limestone cuts through protective gear, the narrow passages between pinnacles trap heat and moisture, and the abundance of endemic species living within this ecosystem means that human intrusion threatens the very organisms adapted to survive in this extreme environment. The persistence of this place as an unexplored frontier, despite modern technology, and our species' relentless drive to map and catalog every corner of Earth speaks to a fundamental acceptance that certain landscapes exist beyond human dominion, places where nature has created conditions so inherently hostile that exploration beckons. Deep within the island of Trinidad lies one of the world's largest natural reserves of asphalt, a place where the very ground beneath your feet exists in a state of perpetual transformation, where solid matter behaves with the patient, inexorable movement of something far more fluid, and where the surface itself presents a paradox that has fascinated and mystified explorers for centuries. Pitch Lake covers approximately 114 acres, and its interior represents a landscape so hostile, so fundamentally unstable, that the scientific community has largely deemed it too dangerous for extensive human exploration or prolonged study, a designation that stands almost unquestioned despite the fact that people have walked upon its surface for generations without comprehensive understanding of what lies beneath. The asphalt that comprises this lake exists in a state of slow, continuous flux, where the ground can support your weight one moment and begin to envelop you the next, where pressure from above triggers releases of gas from below, where the thermal properties shift based on ambient temperature and seasonal variation, creating zones of relative stability interspersed with areas of genuine peril that defy easy prediction or mapping. The psychological mechanism that prevents deeper exploration operates through a combination of genuine physical danger and an almost cultural acceptance that some places simply should not be fully known, that mystery serves a purpose, that the boundary between exploration and foolhardiness requires us to accept that comprehensive knowledge of every terrestrial space may not be worth the cost it demands. We have normalized the idea that Pitch Lake's interior must remain partially unknowable, that the risks inherent in extended excavation or drilling justify our collective restraint, and in doing so, we have created a space of acceptable ignorance in the modern world, a place where the absence of detailed. Deep beneath the permafrost of northeastern Siberia, particularly in the Yamal Peninsula region, lie massive crater formations that have emerged only in recent decades as the frozen ground has begun to thaw and collapse inward, creating voids so vast and so geometrically perfect that they resemble nothing so much as the work of intentional engineering rather than natural geological processes. These craters, some reaching depths of over 200 feet and widths exceeding 150 feet, contain interiors so unstable and so chemically volatile that the few scientists who have managed to conduct research on their edges have documented methane plumes rising from their depths with such force and concentration that the gas ignites spontaneously when exposed to atmospheric oxygen, creating ghostly flames that burn without fuel in a way that defies casual explanation. The interior walls of these formations reveal layers of ice, organic matter, and sediment that have been locked in frozen stasis for tens of thousands of years, and as they collapse into the widening voids below, they release ancient methane deposits and create conditions so toxic and unpredictable that even brief exploratory descents become exercises in extraordinary risk that most scientific institutions have deemed categorically unjustifiable. What makes these craters particularly resistant to human exploration is not merely their physical instability, though that alone would be prohibitive, but rather the psychological acceptance we have cultivated regarding certain places on Earth as fundamentally inaccessible, as though some regions exist partly outside the domain of human curiosity and investigation, and we have normalized this acceptance so thoroughly that we scarcely question it anymore. Even as technology advances to permit descents that would have seemed impossible merely a decade prior, suggesting that our restraint may stem less from genuine impossibility. Deep within the dense rainforests of Papua New Guinea lies a geography so remote and impenetrable that entire populations of humans have remained isolated from the outside world for thousands of years, existing in a state of complete separation from modern civilization and technological advancement. These uncontacted zones represent some of the last truly unexplored territories on Earth, where indigenous communities live according to their own social structures, belief systems, and survival strategies without any knowledge of the broader human experience beyond their forest boundaries. The terrain itself acts as a natural barrier of extraordinary proportions, with mountainous jungles so thick and difficult to traverse that even the most determined expeditions struggle to penetrate more than a few kilometers into certain regions. The psychological mechanism underlying our fascination with these places stems from a fundamental human curiosity about what remains unknown and unknowable, the deep ancestral drive to explore and categorize every corner of our planet, combined with the paradoxical realization that some places may remain permanently beyond our reach. There exists a logical contradiction in how we approach uncontacted peoples, simultaneously driven by anthropological interest and ethical concerns about preservation, creating a tension between the desire to document and study these communities and the understanding that contact itself causes irreversible cultural disruption and often catastrophic health consequences through disease exposure. Despite having sophisticated satellite technology, advanced mapping systems, and resources that could theoretically locate and reach any human settlement on Earth, we have normalized the existence of these zones as acceptable exceptions to our otherwise comprehensive knowledge of human geography, treating the inability to explore certain regions as almost quaint rather than recognizing it as a who. Deep within the ocean floor, at depths that exceed 2,000 meters, lie some of the most alien environments on Earth, places so hostile and chemically extreme that they remain almost entirely unexplored by human beings. These are the deep brine pools, hypersaline bodies of water that exist on the abyssal plains of our planet, created when water becomes so saturated with dissolved salts that it becomes denser than the surrounding seawater and sinks to the lowest points of the ocean basins. The most famous of these pools, discovered in the Red Sea in the 1960s, contain water up to 9 times saltier than normal ocean water, creating a distinct boundary between the brine and the regular seawater above, a sharp line that divides two completely different marine worlds from one another. Around these pools, the water temperature can reach temperatures that approach 50 degrees Celsius, heated by geothermal vents beneath the Earth's crust, while the pressure at these depths crushes down with a force of over 200 atmospheres, creating conditions so extreme that life forms adapted to exist there operate on principles of chemistry and physics that seem to violate our understanding of biology itself. The psychological draw of these places stems from a fundamental human curiosity about the unknown, a desire to understand the boundaries of where life can exist, and how organisms have adapted to circumstances so far removed from anything we experience on the surface of our world. We are drawn to these depths because they represent the absolute frontier of exploration, a place where our instruments barely function and our understanding of biological possibility is constantly being challenged and redefined by new discoveries of extremophile organisms thriving in conditions we once believed would be completely sterile and dead. Deep within the Tibetan Plateau, where the world's third longest river carves through the eastern Himalayas, lies one of Earth's most impenetrable canyons, a place so treacherous and remote that its deepest sections remain virtually unmapped and largely unexplored by human hands. The Yarlung Tsangpo Gorge stretches for over 150 kilometers, with walls that rise nearly 5,000 meters in some places, creating a chasm so narrow and violent that the river below becomes a white fury of rapids and waterfalls that few have ever witnessed firsthand and fewer still have survived attempting to navigate. The gorge's remoteness stems not merely from its geographical isolation on the Tibetan Plateau, but from the extreme conditions that persist within its depths, where the river drops in elevation faster than nearly any other river system on Earth, creating sections of rapids so severe and unpredictable that even modern expedition equipment and expertise offer no guarantee of safety or successful passage through its narrowest, most violent stretches. What makes this place psychologically fascinating is how humans have developed an almost mythical reverence for the gorge precisely because it remains so fundamentally unknowable to us, so resistant to our attempts at documentation and conquest, that we have learned to accept vast sections of it as places we simply cannot reach, places where our technology and determination ultimately fail in the face of natural forces that operate at scales beyond our control or reliable prediction. We have normalized the idea that some geographical features on our own planet will remain largely mysteries, that some rivers will flow through some canyons forever, and that this absence of knowledge is not a temporary condition waiting for better equipment or clever engineering, but rather a permanent feature of our relationship with certain extreme environments, a humbling reminder that exploration it. Deep beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea, particularly off the coast of Belize, lies a geological formation so vast and so enigmatic that it has captivated explorers and scientists for decades, yet remains largely unexplored beyond the first few hundred meters of its mysterious depths. The Great Blue Hole is a massive sinkhole, a perfect circle of dark water approximately 310 meters across, dropping down into the earth in a way that creates an almost hypnotic visual gradient from shallow turquoise water at its edges to the deepest midnight blue at its center, a color so profound and pure that it seems to absorb light itself rather than reflect it. What lies beneath this threshold into absolute darkness remains fundamentally unknown to us, not because we lack the technology to explore it, but because the conditions at depth create an environment so hostile and so physically demanding that the human body begins to fail in ways that are both subtle and catastrophic. The walls descend into a labyrinth of underwater caves and passages, with hydrogen sulfide layers that poison the water, oxygen depletion zones where life cannot survive, and pressures that compress and damage human physiology in ways that were not fully understood until relatively recently in the history of deep diving. You know intellectually that the Blue Hole is merely a geological artifact, a collapsed limestone cave system created over millennia by water erosion and tectonic shifts, nothing more than geology and physics rendered visible, yet there exists a psychological pull toward it, a human compulsion to reach deeper, to know what lies in that ultimate darkness, that persists despite our rational understanding of the danger and despite the fact that exploring it serves no practical purpose for society. Deep within the remote tabletop mountains of southeastern Venezuela, where the landscape rises dramatically from the surrounding jungle in sheer vertical cliffs reaching heights of nearly 3,000 meters, exist some of Earth's most inaccessible geological formations known as tepuy sinkholes, vast circular depressions that have formed over millions of years through the collapse of cave systems within these ancient sandstone plateaus. These sinkholes represent a particular challenge to human exploration because they combine multiple barriers simultaneously. The tepuys themselves are located in regions so geographically isolated that reaching their summits requires specialized climbing equipment and permits from Venezuelan authorities, and once explorers have somehow managed to ascend these formidable rock faces, they then discover that descending into the sinkholes themselves presents an entirely separate and often more perilous undertaking. The psychological mechanism that keeps these sinkholes largely unexplored relates to our natural aversion to layered risk environments, where multiple danger factors compound rather than exist in isolation, creating a deterrent effect that operates almost independently of whether any single factor would be prohibitively dangerous on its own. What persists in keeping these formations inaccessible is the peculiar human tendency to avoid situations where success in one phase merely opens the door to danger in another phase, generating a psychological state where the prospect of having to continuously overcome successive challenges becomes more daunting than any individual challenge would be, causing experienced mountaineers and cave explorers to rationally decide that the investment of resources, time, and personal safety required to properly investigate even a single sinkhole simply exceeds whatever scientific or exploratory benefits might be obtained, and so these remarkable natural formations. Deep beneath the surfaces of extinct and dormant volcanic calderas lies a realm that remains almost entirely unexplored by human presence, a sunken amphitheater of stone and ash where the very geology speaks of catastrophic transformation. These vast circular depressions, formed when magma chambers beneath volcanoes emptied during eruptions and caused the overlying rock to collapse inward, create natural bowls sometimes measuring miles across and descending thousands of feet into the earth. The floors of these calderas present an environment of extreme complexity, where acidic geothermal springs bubble up from deep fissures, where toxic gases accumulate in invisible pockets, and where the rock itself remains unstable, prone to sudden shifts and collapses that could trap or bury any explorer foolish enough to venture into their depths. The psychological draw toward these places stems from our fundamental human curiosity about extreme environments and the desire to witness geological processes in their rawest form, to stand where the earth has literally torn itself open and reformed. Yet we approach these spaces with rational caution, because the dangers are not merely speculative but verifiable through countless failed or abandoned expeditions, through the testimony of geologists who have studied them from their safer rims, and through the simple physics of unstable terrain and accumulating noxious vapors. What persists despite our knowledge of these hazards is a romanticized vision of discovery, a lingering belief that somewhere in these hidden geological theaters lies evidence of processes we have yet to fully understand, or perhaps minerals and formations unique to the violent transformation that created them. We have normalized the inaccessibility of caldera floors by reframing it not as failure but as ecological protection, declaring many of them restricted zones and sacred geological sites, allowing us to maintain the fiction that we. Beneath the surface of Oymyakon, one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth, lies a frozen world that extends hundreds of meters down into darkness, where human exploration becomes not merely difficult but fundamentally impossible due to the nature of the permafrost itself. The ground here remains permanently frozen, a solid mass of earth and ice that has accumulated over thousands of years, creating a barrier that shifts and changes in ways that defy our usual understanding of geology. When researchers attempt to drill down into this permafrost, they encounter layers that have been untouched since the last ice age, containing organic matter and ancient environments preserved in a state of suspension. Yet the deeper they go, the more the frozen ground becomes hostile to human presence and investigation. The psychological response to this environment stems from a profound recognition that we are encountering time itself made physical, a tangible representation of epochs we cannot access, and this creates a peculiar form of existential unease because we can see the hole being drilled down, we can comprehend the depth being measured, yet we cannot truly explore what lies there without fundamentally altering it. What persists despite this logical impossibility is our continued attempt to understand and measure these depths, our insistence on quantifying the unknown even when the act of quantification destroys the very conditions that make the discovery valuable, and somehow we have normalized this paradox, accepting that there are places on our own planet where our traditional methods of exploration fail us, where the Earth itself resists our inquiry not through hostility, but through the simple, overwhelming fact of its own frozen permanence and incomprehensibility. Beneath the surface of every ocean on Earth, far below the reach of sunlight and the depths where pressure becomes almost incomprehensible, there exist vast plains that stretch across the planet like underwater deserts, remaining almost entirely unexplored by human observation. These abyssal plains cover more than half of the ocean floor, spreading across millions of square kilometers at depths typically between 3,000 and 6,000 meters, creating landscapes so remote and hostile that we have mapped them less thoroughly than we have mapped the surface of Mars or the Moon itself. The crushing pressure at these depths, the absolute darkness, the frigid temperatures that hover just above freezing, and the complete absence of any natural light source combine to create an environment so fundamentally alien to human experience that our minds struggle to construct meaningful imagery of what exists there. We know these plains exist because we have sent robotic submersibles and remote sensing equipment to gather data. Yet the vast majority of the abyssal floor remains unseen by any human eye, untouched by any human hand, and unknown in the specific details of its topography and ecology. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept this profound gap in human knowledge relates to the simple fact that these places offer us nothing immediately useful, no resources to extract, no territories to claim, and no way to establish any kind of permanent human presence, which means our innate drive to explore and dominate has found little purchase in motivating sustained investigation. We have normalized this incompleteness in our understanding of our own planet, because the abyssal plains exist in a realm where human capability fundamentally falters, where the engineering challenges and the expenses required to conduct meaningful exploration exceed what most nations or institutions are willing to invest in studying what many consider mere. Deep beneath the Sierra de Naka Mountains in Chihuahua, Mexico, lies a cavern so inhospitable to human existence that it has become one of the most inaccessible places on our planet. A subterranean cathedral of selenite crystals that grow to the size of tree trunks and create an otherworldly landscape that seems to belong to another world entirely. The cave sits approximately 900 meters below the surface, nestled within layers of limestone and dolomite, and the temperature inside remains a constant 48 degrees Celsius. A heat so intense and unforgiving that human flesh begins to deteriorate within minutes of exposure to the superheated air that fills every crevice and chamber. The humidity inside approaches 100%, creating an atmosphere so thick and suffocating that each breath becomes a struggle, as the air itself seems to resist entry into the lungs, and the combination of extreme heat and moisture works together in a choreography of discomfort that makes extended human presence virtually impossible without specialized protective equipment that pushes the limits of modern technology. Scientists have determined that unprotected human exposure to these conditions results in death within approximately 10 to 15 minutes, as the body's core temperature rises uncontrollably and the vital organs begin to shut down in a cascade of thermal stress that cannot be reversed once it begins. The psychological mechanism that drives exploration, despite these impossible conditions, stems from humanity's fundamental need to understand and document the extremes of our world, to push against the boundaries of what we consider survivable, and to satisfy a deep curiosity about places that remain fundamentally alien and untouched by human presence. Beneath the surface of the Ross Ice Shelf, one of Earth's largest floating ice formations, lies a vast and largely unexplored realm that extends downward into darkness and extreme pressure, where the ice shelf meets the ocean water in ways that remain fundamentally mysterious to human understanding. The Ross Ice Shelf itself is a massive structure the size of Spain, floating on the Ross Sea in Antarctica, and while scientists have established research stations on its surface, the underside and the water column immediately beneath it represent a frontier that remains inaccessible to direct human exploration due to the combination of extreme cold, crushing pressure, and the technological limitations that have thus far prevented sustained investigation. The psychological draw toward understanding what lies beneath such remote and imposing structures stems from our fundamental human curiosity about hidden environments, the same impulse that drives us to explore caves or deep ocean trenches. Yet in this case, the barriers are so formidable that we find ourselves accepting our ignorance as inevitable rather than confronting our inability to breach these limits. The base of the ice shelf exists in perpetual darkness, where the water temperature hovers near freezing and the pressure from the weight of millions of tons of ice creates conditions so severe that only the most specialized and fragile organisms can survive, organisms that we have barely cataloged or understood despite their existence. What persists in our collective consciousness is a strange normalization of this vast blind spot on our planet, the acceptance that certain places will simply remain unknown to us, that some frontiers are too dangerous or too expensive to cross, and therefore we have come to treat them not as challenges to overcome, but as natural boundaries of human knowledge that we acknowledge and then move past without the discomfort that such acceptance should perhaps in. Deep within the vast expanse of the Amazon rainforest, spanning across Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador, exist pockets of human civilization that remain almost entirely isolated from the modern world, communities whose members have deliberately chosen or circumstantially found themselves cut off from outside contact for generations, living in regions so remote and densely forested that their exact locations, populations, and ways of life remain largely unknown to cartographers and anthropologists alike. These uncontacted tribes, estimated to number anywhere from several hundred to potentially thousands of individuals distributed across dozens of separate groups, inhabit territories so impenetrable that even satellite imagery struggles to pierce the canopy overhead, creating zones of genuine human mystery in an age where most of Earth's surface has been catalogued and documented. The psychological mechanism that allows these populations to remain hidden operates on two fundamental levels. First, the sheer physical impossibility of sustained exploration in an environment that actively resists human intrusion through disease, hostile wildlife, treacherous terrain, and weather patterns that can transform passable routes into impassable swamps within hours. And second, the deliberate cultural choice by many of these groups to repel outside contact after historical encounters with colonizers, slave traders, and disease-carrying explorers left devastating marks on their communities. What persists as remarkable is how thoroughly normalized this gap in human knowledge has become despite our technological sophistication. How we have accepted that in the 21st century, entire populations living on the same planet can remain unmapped and unknown, protected not by government decree but by geography itself, by the rainforest's impenetrability, and by the rational fear of outsiders that generations of trauma have instilled in these society. Deep beneath the surface of the Atacama Salt Flats in northern Chile lies an entirely unexplored realm that remains virtually untouched by human investigation. A subterranean world of crystalline chambers and mineral-rich aquifers that extends hundreds of meters down into the Earth's crust, creating an environment so extreme and alien that even our most advanced drilling equipment and remote sensing technology struggles to map its true dimensions and composition. The salt flats themselves represent one of the driest places on Earth, where rainfall is measured in millimeters per decade and the surface appears utterly barren and lifeless. Yet this arid characterization belies the complex hydrological systems operating invisibly below, where pressurized brines and mineral solutions flow through ancient cavities and passages that may contain ecosystems unlike anything documented by modern science. What makes the depths below these flats so resistant to exploration is fundamentally the economics and logistics of going deep into such an inhospitable region. The combination of extreme remoteness, the corrosive nature of hypersaline solutions that corrode drilling equipment, the unpredictable pressure systems that can cause sudden collapses, and the sheer cost of maintaining operations in one of Earth's most desolate environments creates a barrier that keeps this realm sealed off from human discovery. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept this persistent ignorance stems from our inherent tendency to assume that what we cannot easily access is either insignificant or naturally forbidden to us. And we have normalized the existence of these vast underground territories as simply part of the planet's natural design, places that exist in a category beyond our responsibility to understand. Yet each year, as drilling technology improves and corporate interest in mineral extraction increases, the pressure to penetrate these depths grows. Deep within the Southern Ocean, where the waters churn with relentless force and few vessels dare to venture, lies Heard Island, a remote volcanic outpost that remains one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, shrouded perpetually in fog and storm systems that make human exploration not merely difficult but genuinely life-threatening. The island itself, located roughly halfway between Madagascar and Antarctica, hosts Big Ben, an active stratovolcano that rises nearly 9,000 feet above the surrounding ocean, its peak perpetually capped with glaciers that slowly retreat with each passing decade, while its slopes rumble with geothermal activity that scientists can only monitor from vast distances through satellite imaging and seismic instruments planted on the island during rare, carefully planned expeditions. The volcano's remoteness creates a psychological distance between humanity and this geological phenomenon, a sense that it belongs entirely to nature's domain rather than ours, and this separation feeds our fascination because we are drawn to forces we cannot control or frequently observe, forces that operate according to their own ancient rhythms regardless of human curiosity or desire. What makes Heard Island particularly compelling as an unexplorable location is not merely the physical danger of the journey itself, which includes weeks of treacherous ocean crossing through some of the most temperamental waters on the planet, but rather the sheer indifference of the environment, the way weather patterns form and dissolve with no consideration for human ambitions or scientific goals. We have somehow accepted this remoteness as appropriate, as if there should exist certain places on our world that remain perpetually beyond our reach, and this acceptance persists despite our modern capabilities, because the cost of true exploration there exceeds reasonable justification, not in terms of money alone, but in genuine risk to human L. Lake Tanganyika stretches across nearly 370 miles of the African continent, bordered by Tanzania, Democratic Republic of Congo, Burundi, and Zambia, making it the second deepest freshwater lake in the world with depths that plunge beyond 4,700 feet into an almost entirely unexplored abyss, where the pressure becomes so immense that human bodies would collapse instantly under the weight of water pressing down from every direction. The lake's deepest trenches remain virtually untouched by human exploration, because the extreme depth creates conditions so hostile and inhospitable that even the most advanced diving equipment and submersibles face nearly insurmountable technical challenges. With the profound darkness beginning just beyond the first few hundred feet, where light simply ceases to penetrate, and the water temperature drops to near freezing, while the pressure increases exponentially with each additional meter of descent. This psychological barrier exists because humans have evolved as surface-dwelling creatures with an intuitive understanding of shallow water, but no evolutionary framework for comprehending what exists in the crushing depths of ancient lakes, creating a mental disconnect between the water we see and the unknowable realm beneath it. We have normalized our ignorance of Lake Tanganyika's deepest sections by treating them as irrelevant to human life, assigning them no cultural significance, and feeling no compulsion to explore them despite possessing the intellectual capability to build better submersibles and deeper diving technology. Suggesting that our acceptance of this particular mystery stems not from technical impossibility, but from psychological indifference rooted in the lake's remoteness, and the lack of perceived economic or strategic value in knowing what lives or exists in those bottomless zones where the water becomes as alien and foreign as the atmosphere of distant plan. Beneath the perpetually frozen surface of the Arctic Ocean lies one of Earth's most inaccessible frontiers, a realm of crushing darkness and extreme pressure that remains almost entirely unknown to human experience. The Arctic Ocean floor spans approximately 5.5 million square kilometers, yet we have mapped less than 20% of it with any meaningful detail, making it statistically less explored than the surface of Mars or the Moon. The extreme conditions that define this environment include temperatures that plummet to nearly -2 degrees Celsius, water pressure that increases exponentially with depth, and seasonal ice coverage that can exceed 15 million square kilometers, creating a barrier so formidable that even our most advanced icebreaker vessels struggle to penetrate its interior regions. The darkness is absolute beyond the reach of sunlight, which typically penetrates only the uppermost 200 meters, leaving the deeper trenches and vast abyssal plains in permanent night, where bioluminescence becomes the only source of illumination for the creatures that have evolved to inhabit these depths. The human mind struggles to comprehend environments so fundamentally alien to our evolutionary experience, and this psychological distance between our consciousness and these physical spaces creates a peculiar form of mental rejection, where we simultaneously acknowledge the Arctic Ocean floor's existence while treating it as functionally non-existent because our brains cannot easily simulate or contextualize what it feels like to be there. We have normalized our ignorance of the Arctic Ocean floor by framing it as a problem of technology rather than of will, telling ourselves that we simply lack the right instruments, submarines, and funding, when in truth the primary barrier remains the fundamental hostility of the environment itself and our species' biological unsuitability for surviving in it, a fact that P. Bouvet Island sits in the South Atlantic Ocean, nearly equidistant from Antarctica and South Africa, a remote volcanic mass so isolated that it remains one of the least explored places on Earth, and its interior remains almost entirely unknown to human observation. The island itself covers only about 30 square kilometers, yet the vast majority of its terrain has never been systematically surveyed or documented by any expedition, existing instead as a theoretical landscape defined more by educated guesses and satellite imagery than by human footsteps or direct investigation. The interior is shrouded perpetually in fog and clouds, wrapped in conditions so severe that even brief visits to the coastal regions present extraordinary challenges, making the island's heart an environment that has resisted human knowledge despite centuries of maritime history passing by its shores. What compels us to leave places like this unmapped is not primarily a failure of technology or capability, but rather the fundamental cost-benefit calculation that explorers and scientific organizations make when deciding where to direct their limited resources and personnel. The psychological mechanism at work involves a rational assessment that the interior of Bouvet Island offers no strategic advantage, no mineral wealth that justifies the extreme risk, and no compelling scientific mystery that outweighs the danger and expense of mounting a proper expedition into its glaciated valleys and volcanic peaks. We have normalized this absence of knowledge by accepting that some places on Earth can simply remain unknown, that the complete documentation of our planet is not a necessary goal, and that mystery itself has become acceptable in our modern age of comprehensive mapping and satellite surveillance. Deep beneath the surfaces of volcanic regions across the world, there exists an intricate labyrinth of hollow passages carved by ancient rivers of molten rock, structures so vast and complex that they remain almost entirely unexplored by human beings, existing in states of perpetual darkness and isolation that seem to belong to another world entirely. These volcanic tubes, also known as lava tubes or lava caves, form when the outer layer of flowing lava cools and solidifies while the interior continues to drain away, leaving behind enormous hollow conduits that can stretch for miles underground, some wide enough to accommodate multi-story buildings, some so narrow that a human body could barely fit through, creating a three-dimensional maze that exists beyond the reach of conventional exploration. The most famous and accessible examples, such as those found in Hawaii, Iceland, the Canary Islands, and beneath the moon itself according to lunar surveys, represent only the smallest fraction of what lies beneath our feet, as countless more remain sealed, filled with water, or blocked by geological formations that make entry impossible or extraordinarily dangerous. What makes these spaces so compelling from an exploratory standpoint is not merely their physical inaccessibility, but their fundamental unknowability. Each tube contains its own ecosystem, its own geological history, its own chemical composition, and potentially its own discoveries about how our planet functions and how life might adapt to extreme underground environments. The psychological draw toward exploring volcanic tubes stems from humanity's deep desire to map the unmappable, to understand the hidden architecture of our world, to venture into spaces where light has never reached, and where the laws of surface geology no longer apply in quite the same way. Deep within the Congo Basin lies one of Earth's most impenetrable territories, a sprawling expanse of rainforest so dense and complex that vast regions remain virtually unexplored by human civilization, where the canopy rises to heights exceeding 150 feet, creating a perpetual twilight beneath layers of vegetation so thick that satellite imagery struggles to penetrate the verdant barrier, and where the terrain itself transforms into a labyrinth of waterlogged soil. Tangled root systems and impenetrable undergrowth that defeats even the most determined expeditions. The interior of this ancient forest contains ecosystems that have evolved in isolation for millennia, harboring species unknown to science, animal populations that avoid human contact at every turn, and indigenous communities whose territories remain deliberately isolated from the outside world. What makes this region so fundamentally unexplorable is not merely the physical difficulty of navigating its landscape. Though the humidity regularly exceeds 95%, the temperature maintains a constant warmth that drains endurance, and the prevalence of disease-carrying insects and parasites creates genuine biological hazards that make prolonged exposure genuinely dangerous. Rather, the barrier to exploration operates on a deeper level, functioning as a psychological threshold where the sheer sensory overload of the environment, the disorientation caused by perpetual sameness, the weight of isolation, and the rational recognition of one's insignificance within such an overwhelming landscape combine to create a mental resistance that exceeds the physical obstacles. This resistance persists because we have largely accepted that some regions on our planet maintain their mystery by right, that not every corner of Earth requires human understanding or documentation, and that the Congo's interior serves an important function precisely because it remains Bayo. Deep within the Horn of Africa, where the borders of Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Djibouti converge in a landscape of extraordinary geological violence, lies the Afar Triangle, a region where the Earth itself appears to be tearing itself apart in slow motion, creating one of the planet's most inhospitable and largely unexplored terrain systems. The Afar Depression, which dominates this triangle, descends to depths of over 400 meters below sea level in certain locations, making it one of the lowest points on Earth's continental surface, and throughout this vast expanse, massive rift systems cut through the ground like gaping wounds, some extending for hundreds of kilometers across the barren, volcanic landscape. These rifts are not merely geological formations, but are active zones where three tectonic plates, the African plate, the Arabian plate, and the Somali plate, are actively diverging from one another, which means the ground itself is continuously pulling apart, creating new crust at a rate that researchers can measure and observe over relatively short time spans. The combination of extreme heat, reaching temperatures that regularly exceed 50 degrees Celsius, the toxic volcanic gases that periodically vent from deep beneath the surface, the unpredictable flash flooding that sweeps through narrow canyons with devastating force, and the absolute remoteness of the region, where distances between human settlements can stretch across 100 kilometers or more of uninhabited wilderness, has made comprehensive exploration and study of these rifts extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The psychological mechanism that keeps humans from fully exploring and understanding the Afar Triangle relates fundamentally to our species' deep-rooted aversion to environments that combine multiple simultaneous threats without the possibility of rapid escape or rescue, because the mind recognizes these places not as challenges to overcome, but as spaces. Deep beneath the churning waters of the South Atlantic Ocean, where the Scotia Sea meets the Southern Ocean in a region of perpetual storm and darkness, lies the Scotia Trench, a submarine canyon so remote and so profoundly isolated that it represents one of the last truly unexplored frontiers of our planet. The trench descends to depths exceeding 8,000 meters, creating a void so vast and so utterly separated from human experience that our knowledge of its floor remains fragmentary and incomplete, gathered only through occasional sonar readings and rare robotic surveys that venture into its crushing depths. This underwater chasm sits in one of Earth's most hostile marine environments, where water temperatures hover just above freezing, where pressure reaches nearly 900 times that of the surface atmosphere, and where the currents flow with such violence that even our most advanced submersibles can only briefly penetrate its mysteries before retreating to safety. The Scotia Trench floor represents a fundamental limitation of human exploration, not because the technology to reach it has failed to develop, but because the location itself exists in such a remote corner of the world, so far from any established research infrastructure and so difficult to access during the brief windows of favorable weather, that mounting an expedition requires resources, planning, and institutional commitment that few organizations have chosen to invest. What makes this place psychologically compelling is the recognition that we have mapped the surface of the Moon and sent rovers to Mars, yet this portion of our own planet remains shrouded in darkness and uncertainty, a contradiction that speaks to how human exploration follows the path of ambition and prestige rather than necessity. Beneath the endless golden dunes of the Sahara Desert lies one of the planet's most inaccessible water systems, vast underground aquifers that stretch across millions of square kilometers and contain some of the oldest freshwater reserves on Earth, yet remain almost entirely unexplored by human eyes due to their profound depth, the extreme difficulty of access, and the sheer logistical impossibility of conducting comprehensive surveys across such a hostile and expansive terrain. These aquifers, particularly the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System and the Northwestern Sahara Aquifer System, hold water that fell as rain tens of thousands of years ago when the climate was dramatically different, water that has been sealed beneath layers of impermeable rock and sand for longer than human civilization has existed, creating a hidden ocean of incomprehensible age and scale. The psychological mechanism that allows these aquifers to remain largely unmapped is rooted in the fundamental human limitation of scale perception and accessibility. We struggle to conceive of systems that exist beyond our sensory range and beyond our technological reach without extraordinary effort, and the Sahara's aquifers represent exactly this kind of boundary where our normal methods of exploration become inadequate. The extreme heat, the vast distances, the unstable geology, and the crushing depths make direct exploration prohibitively expensive and dangerous. So we have instead relied on remote sensing, mathematical modeling, and limited drilling operations to infer their properties rather than truly investigate them. What persists is a paradox where we know these aquifers exist and can estimate their volume through geological science, yet they remain profoundly mysterious, fundamentally unknowable through direct human observation, and this contradiction has become so normalized in our scientific discourse that we rarely acknowledge the profound gap between knowing. The Coral Sea, stretching across more than 1 million square kilometers between Australia's Great Barrier Reef and the deeper waters of the Tasman Sea, contains vast abyssal regions that remain almost entirely unexplored despite their proximity to one of Earth's most studied ecosystems. These underwater canyons and trenches descend into perpetual darkness, where pressures exceed 1,000 atmospheres, temperatures hover just above freezing, and the few organisms that exist have adapted to an environment so hostile that our technology struggles to gather even basic observational data. The deeper portions of the Coral Sea abyss lie beyond the reach of standard deep-sea submersibles, and the logistical challenges of deploying equipment in these remote waters mean that vast territories remain unmapped and unstudied, their geological formations and biological communities existing in complete obscurity. Our inability to explore these regions stems partly from the extreme conditions themselves, which corrode equipment and drain power sources within hours, but also from the simple reality that funding and scientific interest concentrate on the more accessible coral ecosystems above rather than the barren darkness below. We have constructed an elaborate psychological framework that permits us to consider the nearby Great Barrier Reef thoroughly documented, while dismissing the abyssal regions beneath it as inconsequential. Though these depths likely harbor unique geological formations and potentially undiscovered species that could reshape our understanding of deep-sea biology. This cognitive separation allows us to feel satisfied with our exploration efforts while leaving the most extreme and least accessible portions of one of the world's most significant marine regions in permanent obscurity. A contradiction we have normalized so thoroughly that few pause to consider what knowledge awaits in that crushing darkness just beyond our reach. Deep beneath the frozen tundra of northeastern Siberia lies the town of Verkhoyansk, a place so remote and so utterly inhospitable that its very existence seems improbable. Yet the underground spaces beneath it remain largely unexplored and unmapped by modern science. Verkhoyansk holds the distinction of being one of the coldest inhabited places on Earth, where temperatures routinely plummet to -60 degrees Celsius during winter months, creating a permafrost environment so severe that the ground remains frozen year-round to depths of over 1,000 meters. The underground systems that exist beneath this settlement, including natural caves, geological formations, and artificially created structures, remain virtually untouched by systematic exploration because the extreme conditions make any sustained investigation nearly impossible. The few researchers and explorers who have attempted to venture into these underground spaces face not only the crushing cold that penetrates even insulated equipment, but also the unpredictable nature of permafrost, which shifts and changes in ways that can trap or disorient even the most experienced cave explorers. What makes Verkhoyansk Underground particularly inaccessible is the paradoxical nature of the permafrost itself, which simultaneously preserves ancient geological secrets while making them virtually impossible to access. The human mind naturally seeks to understand and document every corner of our world, and yet Verkhoyansk represents a frontier where our tools fail us, where our ambitions meet the immovable wall of planetary physics. We have somehow accepted that certain places will simply remain unknown to us, that some regions of Earth will keep their mysteries not because they are protected or forbidden, but because nature has rendered them too hostile for human intrusion. Deep within the volcanic cone of Mount Erebus in Antarctica lies a persistent lava lake that continues to churn and bubble beneath layers of ice and rock, creating an environment so hostile and inaccessible that no human has ever successfully explored its interior chambers in any meaningful way. The mountain itself stands as the southernmost active volcano on Earth, rising nearly 4,000 meters above the Antarctic plateau, and its interior remains locked away behind temperatures that plummet to -60 degrees Celsius, combined with volcanic gases that would incapacitate or kill any unprotected human within moments of exposure. The lava lake maintains its molten state year-round despite the extreme cold surrounding it, and this thermal anomaly creates a complex system of ice towers, volcanic vents, and unstable cave structures that shift and collapse unpredictably, making any descent into the mountain's depths an exercise in navigating both the destructive heat from below and the lethal cold from the surrounding atmosphere. Scientists understand that the human body cannot withstand the combination of these extremes, the noxious sulfur dioxide emissions, the unpredictable thermal updrafts, and the structural instability of ice and rock that constantly rearrange themselves. Yet we find ourselves drawn to the idea of exploring this place anyway, because it represents one of the last truly unknowable interiors on our planet. The psychological mechanism driving this fascination likely stems from our deep need to map and understand every corner of our world, to conquer the unconquerable, and to witness with our own eyes the raw geological forces that shaped our planet billions of years ago. Despite having sophisticated remote cameras and seismic sensors that feed us more information about Mount Erebus than any previous generation could have imagined, we persist in longing for direct human exploration, somehow believing that standing ends. Deep beneath the rainforests of Borneo lies one of Earth's most extensive and least explored cave networks, stretching across the island's limestone bedrock in a vast subterranean labyrinth that remains largely unmapped and inaccessible to human exploration. The Borneo cave systems, particularly those found in Sarawak and Sabah, represent some of the largest cavern passages ever discovered. With chambers so immense they contain their own ecosystems, underground rivers that flow through absolute darkness for miles, and geological formations that have taken millions of years to develop in complete isolation from the surface world. These caves are home to species found nowhere else on Earth, from eyeless fish navigating underground streams to bats that have never seen daylight, and vast colonies of swiftlets whose nests are harvested for birds' nest soup, a practice that has persisted for centuries without fully understanding what exists deeper within these systems. The psychological draw toward these spaces stems from our fundamental human need to explore and document every corner of our planet. Yet the sheer scale, danger, and complexity of these cave networks create an almost insurmountable barrier that keeps most of them perpetually beyond our reach. The caves flood seasonally, contain passages that require technical diving through zero-visibility water, and hold geological hazards that have claimed experienced spelunkers, making the risk versus reward calculation one that most explorers find prohibitive. What makes the Borneo cave systems particularly fascinating is that despite advances in cave diving technology, mapping equipment, and exploration techniques, we have somehow accepted and normalized the existence of these vast underground worlds that remain effectively unknown to science, regions larger than some countries that we simply acknowledge we may never fully explore, as if the presence of difficulty and danger have become sufficient. Deep beneath the surface of the Andaman Sea, which stretches across the northeastern Indian Ocean between the Andaman Islands and the coasts of Myanmar, Thailand, and the Malay Peninsula, lies a realm of such profound darkness and pressure that human exploration remains severely limited to only the shallowest regions. The depths of this particular body of water extend far beyond our current technological capabilities, reaching abyssal zones where the pressure exceeds 1,000 times that at sea level, crushing everything that sinks into these trenches with an indifferent and absolute force. Most of what we know about the Andaman Sea Depths comes from robotic submersibles and remote sensing equipment, instruments that can withstand these crushing environments far longer than any human body ever could, collecting data and images from a world that exists almost entirely beyond our direct perception. The psychological mechanism that makes these depths so compelling to our collective imagination stems from a fundamental human fear of the unknown combined with our awareness of absolute physical limitation. We understand intellectually that certain places are simply inaccessible to us, that no amount of training or courage can change the basic laws of physics that govern our fragile bodies. Yet despite this clear understanding, we remain drawn to explore these boundaries, funding expeditions and research programs that push incrementally deeper, driven by an impulse to witness and document what lies in darkness. This fascination persists even as we acknowledge the futility of human presence in such places, as we accept that these depths will remain largely alien to our direct experience, known to us only through the mediated lens of our machines and our imagination, a reality that humanity has surprisingly normalized as simply another frontier beyond our grasp rather than a place of genuinely unknowable mystery. Deep within the mountainous regions of South Africa and Lesotho lies the Drakensberg Escarpment, a dramatic geological formation that stretches for hundreds of kilometers along the eastern edge of the southern African plateau, and within its ancient rock faces exist countless cave systems that remain largely unexplored and inaccessible to conventional human exploration. These caves are formed within sandstone and basalt layers that date back millions of years, creating intricate networks of chambers, passages, and underground voids that have been shaped by water erosion, tectonic activity, and the relentless passage of geological time. Yet their precise extent and contents remain largely unknown to modern science. The extreme difficulty of accessing these cave systems stems from their location within nearly vertical cliff faces that plunge thousands of meters downward. Combined with the unpredictable nature of the rock formations themselves, the presence of hidden sinkholes and unstable passages, and the harsh weather conditions that frequently make the region impassable. The psychological mechanism that sustains our fascination with these unexplored spaces relates to the deep human desire to map and understand every corner of our world. Yet the Drakensberg Caves represent a tangible reminder that vast territories remain beyond our reach despite our technological advancement and our collective effort to document everything. We have normalized the existence of these inaccessible places by relegating them to the category of natural wonders that are simply too dangerous or impractical to fully explore, accepting their mystery as an inevitable consequence of human limitation rather than viewing them as an uncomfortable gap in our knowledge. And this acceptance allows us to maintain a sense of control over our understanding of the planet, even as these caves silently persist in their darkness, holding secrets that may never be known to who. Deep beneath the Southern Ocean, roughly 3,000 kilometers southeast of South Africa, lies the Kerguelen Plateau, an underwater mountain range that stretches across thousands of square kilometers in one of Earth's most remote and hostile environments. Where the waters remain perpetually cold, the pressure becomes almost incomprehensible, and the darkness is absolute and unrelenting. The plateau itself rises from depths exceeding 4,000 meters, with some peaks approaching within 1,000 meters of the surface. Yet even these relatively shallow summits remain far beyond the reach of casual human exploration, shrouded in conditions so extreme that only the most specialized deep-sea vehicles and research missions have ever ventured into their vicinity. The Kerguelen Plateau depths represent a frontier so distant and so difficult to access that we have mapped more of the lunar surface than we have explored these underwater mountains. And the few expeditions that have attempted to study this region have returned with data suggesting that vast portions remain completely unmapped and entirely unknown to science. What makes this particular underwater region so persistently inaccessible is not merely the depth or the distance, but rather the convergence of multiple environmental factors that make sustained exploration logistically nightmarish. The extreme weather systems that perpetually batter the Southern Ocean above, the crushing pressures that increase exponentially with descent, the near-freezing temperatures that pose constant threats to equipment and research vessels alike, and the sheer remoteness that means rescue or resupply becomes a matter of weeks rather than hours. Yet despite these genuine and formidable barriers, we have somehow normalized the existence of these depths as simply another place that remains unexplored, another frontier we acknowledge but do not pursue, another mystery we have effectively agreed to ell. Deep within the island of Madagascar lies one of Earth's most impenetrable landscapes, a place where even the most experienced explorers find themselves stopped by nature's own fortress. The Tsingy de Bemaraha, meaning the place where one cannot walk barefoot in the Malagasy language, is a vast expanse of razor-sharp limestone formations that rise like jagged teeth from the forest floor, creating a maze so complex and treacherous that the interior remains largely unmapped and virtually inaccessible to human exploration. These stone spikes, some reaching heights of over 100 feet, were formed over millions of years through the dissolution of limestone by acidic rainwater, creating a landscape so dense and chaotic that walking through it without specialized equipment would result in severe lacerations within moments. The formations are so closely packed together in many sections that a person cannot squeeze between them, and the sharp edges are capable of cutting through rope, flesh, and most conventional climbing gear with alarming ease. The interior of this geological wonder remains largely unexplored because the physical barriers are simply too extreme for standard exploration techniques, and the few researchers who have ventured into the deepest sections required specialized protective equipment and had to move at a pace of mere meters per hour. What makes the Tsingy interior particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how it represents an absolute limit to human curiosity and conquest, a place where our tools and determination genuinely cannot overcome the environment itself. We have become accustomed to the idea that with enough preparation and technology, we can reach anywhere on Earth. Yet the Tsingy interior stands as a stark reminder that some places remain fundamentally beyond our reach, not because of danger alone, but because the landscape itself actively resists penetration in a way that no amount. Beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, hidden under layers of frozen water that stretch down more than 2 miles in some regions, lies an entire mountain range that remains almost completely unknown to human experience. A vast landscape of peaks and valleys that exists in perpetual darkness and extreme pressure, shaped by geological forces that operated long before the ice arrived and continue to operate in ways we can barely comprehend. These subglacial mountains were discovered through satellite measurements and ice-penetrating radar technology that allowed scientists to construct maps of a world that no human eye has ever seen and no human body could ever survive visiting, a realm where the ice itself has become so dense and heavy that it transforms into a substance somewhere between solid rock and liquid, creating conditions that defy our usual categories of understanding. The mountains themselves are real geological features, complete with ridges and canyons and peaks that rise thousands of feet from the bedrock below. Yet they exist in a state of such complete isolation that they have been shaped by processes entirely separate from the world above, where wind and erosion and gravity work in familiar ways. What makes this exploration impossible is not merely the distance or the cold, though both are extreme, but rather the sheer weight of ice pressing down with a force of hundreds of atmospheres, crushing anything that might venture into those spaces, and the absolute certainty that any attempt to drill through or beneath such massive ice sheets would destroy whatever delicate instruments we sent down and would likely trigger catastrophic changes in the ice structure itself. We have accepted this barrier as permanent because the alternative would require technological advances so profound that they seem to belong to a future we cannot yet imagine, and so we have simply filed away these mountains as a curiosity, as something that be. The Alienation Trench stretches for more than 2,000 kilometers along the seismic boundary, where the Pacific Plate descends beneath the North American Plate in one of Earth's most violent geological processes. And the deepest point of this subduction zone reaches approximately 5,400 meters below the surface of the Bering Sea, where the pressure exceeds 550 times that which we experience at sea level. Creating an environment so fundamentally hostile to human exploration that fewer people have touched the floor of this trench than have walked on the surface of the moon. The darkness at such depths is absolute and permanent, a quality of blackness that exists independent of time or observation, where no sunlight has penetrated for millions of years, and where the temperature hovers just above freezing despite the geothermal heat from the Earth's interior being trapped beneath kilometers of sediment and water. The trench floor itself is a landscape of geological contradiction, where ancient oceanic crust is being recycled back into the planetary interior through a process called subduction, creating a zone of extraordinary geological activity that generates the earthquakes and volcanic activity that define the Pacific Ring of Fire. What compels us to develop an almost mythological relationship with these deep places is not merely the physical difficulty of reaching them, but rather the profound realization that certain regions of our own planet remain as fundamentally unknown to us as distant exoplanets, existing in a state of perpetual mystery despite the sophistication of our technology, because the very act of human visitation would fundamentally alter the fragile equilibrium of these ecosystems. We have normalized the existence of unexplored frontiers on Earth by accepting them as natural barriers, inevitable restrictions placed upon us by physics and biology rather than limitations we might over. Beneath the surface of the Congo River lies one of the most profound mysteries of modern exploration, where deep underwater channels plunge into darkness so complete and pressures so intense that human investigation becomes virtually impossible without specialized equipment that few institutions possess or can afford to deploy. The Congo River, which flows through the heart of Africa and represents the world's second largest river by water volume, contains within its depths canyons and channels that extend far below the conventional survey depths, carved over millions of years by currents and geological forces that continue to shape the riverbed in ways we can barely comprehend. These deep channels are home to ecosystems so alien and isolated from sunlight that life forms exist in conditions we struggle to document, photograph, or understand through any direct human observation, as the extreme pressures at depths exceeding 300 meters create an environment where even the most advanced underwater drones and submersibles operate at the very edge of their functional capabilities. The psychological mechanism that keeps these channels largely unexplored stems from a combination of practical limitations and institutional priorities, where the cost of deploying deep-sea research equipment in an inland river system is considered economically unjustifiable when compared to ocean exploration or other scientific endeavors perceived as more immediately valuable. We have normalized this absence of knowledge by accepting that some places simply cannot be reached, integrating the mystery of these depths into a general sense that Africa's most remote natural features remain fundamentally unknowable to science, even as we simultaneously maintain the illusion of living in a fully documented world through satellite imagery and digital cartography that reveal surface features while concealing everything that lies beneath the water's opaque surface. Deep within the Amazon basin, where the world's largest rainforest meets an intricate network of underground passages, lie the flooded cave systems that remain largely unexplored and virtually inaccessible to human investigation. These caves exist in a state of perpetual submersion, their passages filled with water that rises and falls with the seasonal flooding patterns of the Amazon River and its countless tributaries, creating an environment so hostile and unpredictable that even the most experienced cave divers and explorers have ventured only into the outermost chambers. The water itself presents a primary obstacle, as it is often murky and sediment-laden, reducing visibility to mere inches or complete darkness, while the passages themselves narrow dramatically in many sections, creating underwater siphons and tight constrictions that would require advanced technical diving skills and specialized equipment to navigate safely. Beyond the physical dangers of drowning or equipment failure, these caves harbor an entire ecosystem of organisms adapted to total darkness and high pressure, including blind fish species, colorless crustaceans, and microorganisms that have never been formally cataloged or studied by science. The caves also contain geological formations of extraordinary age and complexity, stalactites and stalagmites that have taken millions of years to form, yet remain untouched and undocumented, preserved in their natural state simply because reaching them would require resources and expertise that exceed what most institutions are willing to dedicate to the endeavor. Yet despite the existence of these remarkable underground worlds, we continue to treat them as peripheral mysteries, interesting only in passing conversation, while most of our attention and funding flows toward exploring outer space and deep ocean trenches that seem more relevant to our immediate understanding of existence. Deep within the Canadian Arctic, Baffin Island hosts one of the most formidable and inaccessible glacial systems on Earth, a vast network of ice fields and outlet glaciers that remain almost entirely unexplored by human expedition. These glaciers, including the massive Barents ice cap and countless unnamed valley glaciers, cover thousands of square kilometers across the island's interior and coastal regions, creating an environment so hostile and remote that even modern exploration teams struggle to penetrate beyond the outer edges of these frozen landscapes. The combination of extreme cold, treacherous crevasse fields hidden beneath fresh snow, unpredictable weather systems that can isolate researchers for weeks, and the sheer physical vastness of the terrain means that most of these glaciers have never been thoroughly documented by human presence, remaining largely known only through satellite imagery and occasional brief aerial surveys. The psychological barrier that prevents deeper exploration stems from the fundamental human recognition that some environments have surpassed our technological capability to safely navigate them. And Baffin Island glaciers represent this boundary with particular clarity, as they demand resources, time, and risk tolerance that exceed what most expeditions can justify. There exists within our consciousness a strange normalization of these unexplored spaces, a quiet acceptance that certain places on our own planet will remain unknown to us, that some regions can exist in a state of perpetual mystery despite their proximity to our civilization and despite our advanced tools. And this acceptance has become so embedded in our thinking that we rarely question it, treating these massive glacial systems as though they were simply designed to remain distant and unknowable. As though their inaccessibility were an inherent property rather than a mere reflection of our current limitations and priorities. Beneath the turbulent waters of the Southern Ocean, which encircles the Antarctic continent in a perpetual state of churning chaos, lies a frontier that remains almost entirely unexplored by human consciousness and investigation. The ocean floor in this region stretches across millions of square kilometers, descending into abyssal trenches and vast plateaus where pressures exceed 1,000 times that of the atmosphere above, where temperatures hover just above freezing, and where darkness is so complete that it exists as a concept rather than a mere absence of light. The extreme conditions of the Southern Ocean create a natural barrier that has kept human exploration at bay, as the surface waters themselves are notoriously dangerous, with waves that can exceed 60 feet in height and winds that approach hurricane force with startling regularity, making any sustained effort to study or map the seafloor beneath an undertaking of profound difficulty and considerable risk. Yet despite the technological advances of the modern era, despite our capability to send spacecraft to distant planets and rovers to explore Martian surfaces, the Southern Ocean floor remains largely unknown to us, a realm that exists in our collective awareness primarily as absence rather than presence. The psychological mechanism behind this particular blindness lies partly in our inherent bias toward studying environments that are more accessible and more directly relevant to our current habitats and economic interests. We find it easier to focus on shallow waters near shipping lanes, on continental shelves where resources might be extracted, on regions where tourism or commerce might flourish, rather than investing the enormous resources required to map and study a remote oceanic region that appears to offer little immediate practical value. Beneath the surface of Greenland's vast ice sheet, a hidden network of meltwater channels carves through the frozen landscape like veins carrying liquid through stone, creating subglacial rivers and lakes that exist in almost complete darkness and extreme pressure. Spaces so remote and inaccessible that their true extent and character remain largely unmapped and unknown to human exploration. These channels form during the warmer months when surface melt percolates downward through crevasses and moulins, carving elaborate tunnel systems that wind their way beneath hundreds or even thousands of meters of ice, transporting enormous volumes of sediment-laden water from the ice sheet's interior toward its edges. The channels themselves can range from narrow fissures barely wider than a human body to vast subglacial caverns the size of cathedrals, and their walls are constantly being reshaped by the abrasive flow of glacial meltwater carrying fine rock particles that scour and polish the ice surfaces in perpetual motion. What makes these channels psychologically compelling is the profound unknowability of their specific configurations and the impossibility of sustained human presence within them. Since the water flow rates are unpredictable, the passages narrow without warning, and the entire system exists under conditions of temperature and pressure that would be immediately hostile to any explorer attempting to navigate them. We have normalized the existence of these hidden water networks as simply part of the planetary system, accepting that vast regions of Earth contain environments we may never fully document or understand. Yet we continue to study Greenland's meltwater channels indirectly through remote sensing and mathematical modeling, creating theories about their behavior without ever truly witnessing the lived reality of these subglacial worlds in their complete and unfiltered form. Deep within the heart of northwestern China lies one of Earth's most inhospitable and least explored regions, a vast expanse of sand and stone known as the Taklamakan Desert, whose very name in the Uyghur language translates to "go in and you won't come out," a warning that carries both literal and metaphorical weight for those who have attempted to venture into its most remote central territories. The core of this desert, stretching across more than 130,000 square miles of largely uncharted terrain, represents a landscape so extreme and so fundamentally challenging that modern exploration has barely scratched its surface, with vast portions remaining virtually untouched by human presence or scientific study despite our contemporary technological capabilities. The conditions here are extraordinarily severe, featuring temperatures that fluctuate wildly between below freezing at night to well over 130 degrees Fahrenheit during the day, paired with minimal precipitation that falls perhaps once every few years, creating an environment where water is more precious than gold, and where the very possibility of finding resources to sustain human life becomes increasingly remote as one travels deeper into the interior. The psychological mechanism that keeps the Taklamakan Desert core unexplored operates on multiple levels simultaneously, for it is not merely the physical dangers that deter exploration, but rather the compounding effect of extreme isolation, the unreliability of navigation systems due to massive magnetic anomalies present in the region, and the simple economic calculus that suggests the risks vastly outweigh any potential discoveries or benefits to be gained. What persists in the modern era is a curious paradox wherein we possess satellites capable of imaging every inch of Earth's surface and aircraft that could theoretically traverse the desert. Yet the core remains among the least understood places on our planet, a reality that ref. Deep beneath the waters of the Philippine Sea lies one of Earth's most extreme and inaccessible environments, a place where the Philippine Trench descends to depths exceeding 10,000 meters, creating a world that remains almost entirely unexplored by human presence. The trench floor exists in complete darkness, where the pressure is so immense that it would crush most conventional submersibles and equipment instantaneously, and the temperature hovers just above freezing despite the enormous heat generated from the Earth's core far below. At these depths, the very laws of physics seem to operate differently, with water behaving in ways that defy our surface intuition, and the sparse life forms that exist there move with an otherworldly slowness and deliberation, having adapted to an environment so hostile that it seems almost incomprehensible to those of us who live in the light. We cannot fully explore these depths because our technology, despite all our advancement, remains fundamentally limited by the crushing forces and extreme conditions that govern this underwater realm, and our submarines can only withstand so much pressure before their hulls fail and implode. The psychological draw of the Philippine Trench floor stems from its absolute remoteness, and the fact that fewer humans have witnessed it than have traveled to the moon, creating a paradox where a place on our own planet remains more mysterious and inaccessible than destinations in outer space. We have normalized our inability to explore it by accepting that some places on Earth were simply not meant to be visited by human beings, that there are frontiers we may never cross, and this acceptance has allowed us to live comfortably with the knowledge that vast portions of our planet remain fundamentally unknown and unknowable to our species. Deep beneath the Norwegian Sea, where the continental shelf drops away into abyssal darkness and water temperatures plummet to near freezing, there exist hydrothermal vents that remain almost entirely unknown to human exploration and study. These geological features emerge from the Earth's crust along the mid-ocean ridges, where tectonic plates slowly separate and create pathways for superheated water to rise from the planet's interior, carrying with it a rich cargo of minerals and chemical compounds that have never been fully catalogued by human science. The Norwegian sea vents exist in an environment of such extreme pressure and cold that even the most advanced submersible technology struggles to reach them consistently, and the logistics of mounting repeated expeditions to this remote location have made comprehensive study nearly impossible. What makes this particular field of vents psychologically fascinating is that we have somehow accepted their mysterious nature as inevitable rather than treating it as a profound gap in human knowledge, when in fact these vents may harbor entirely unknown forms of life and geological processes that could fundamentally alter our understanding of how planetary systems function. We have normalized the existence of vast regions on our own planet that remain as alien to us as distant moons, and we have rationalized this ignorance by suggesting that the deep ocean is simply too difficult to explore rather than acknowledging that we have chosen, collectively, to leave these mysteries untouched. The Norwegian sea vents persist in their obscurity not because exploration is impossible, but because the economic incentive and cultural prioritization required to study them has never materialized, and this gap between our capability and our curiosity represents a peculiar blindness in human consciousness, where we have somehow decided that certain mysteries are acceptable to leave unsolved indefinitely. Deep within the southern reaches of South America, spanning across the border between Chile and Argentina in the remote corners of Patagonia, there exists a vast expanse of glacial wilderness known as the Patagonian Ice Fields, a region so extreme and inhospitable that it remains largely unexplored despite its proximity to human civilization and modern technological capabilities. These ice fields cover approximately 13,000 square kilometers of frozen terrain, with towering peaks, crevasse-riddled valleys, and unpredictable weather patterns that shift within moments, creating conditions so treacherous that even the most experienced mountaineers and glaciologists approach with profound caution and extensive preparation. The landscape is characterized by massive interconnected glaciers, including the renowned Perito Morno Glacier, along with countless unnamed ice formations that have never been fully documented or traversed, their surfaces concealing hidden chasms, seracs, and unstable ice bridges that could collapse without warning. What makes the Patagonian ice fields so persistently inaccessible is not merely their physical geography, but the psychological barrier they present to human exploration. A combination of extreme isolation, violent weather systems with wind gusts exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, temperatures that plummet well below freezing, and the simple mathematical reality that the effort required to explore these regions far exceeds the scientific or commercial incentive to do so. We have somehow normalized the existence of vast unexplored territories on our own planet, accepting that certain places remain perpetually beyond our reach despite having satellites orbiting overhead and aircraft capable of traversing the globe. A peculiar contradiction that speaks to how we have compartmentalized our world into the explored and the forbidden, allowing the Patagonian ice fields to persist as a reminder that deep beneath the highest plateau on Earth, where the air itself becomes thin and hostile to human survival, there exists a vast network of caverns and underground systems that remain almost entirely unexplored by modern science, sealed away beneath thousands of meters of rock and permafrost in regions so remote and inhospitable that even the most determined explorers have barely scratched the surface of understanding what lies within. The Tibetan Plateau, already one of the most inaccessible places on the planet due to its extreme altitude, severe weather conditions, and geographical isolation, harbors countless cave systems that have been formed over millions of years through water erosion and geological processes. Yet these underground worlds remain largely untouched because the very conditions that make the plateau so difficult to reach also make venturing into its depths an extraordinary feat of endurance and risk. The extreme cold that persists even in summer months, the unpredictable storms that can appear without warning, the limited oxygen available at such elevation, and the complete absence of rescue infrastructure in these regions create a formidable barrier that transforms any expedition into a potentially fatal undertaking. And this psychological barrier operates in a fascinating way because it exists not merely as a physical obstacle, but as a fundamental limitation on human ambition itself. We have normalized the idea that certain places will simply remain unknown, that the cost of exploration in these extreme zones exceeds any possible benefit or discovery, and we accept this resignation without fully acknowledging that we have chosen to accept ignorance of entire ecosystems and geological formations that could fundamentally alter our understanding of planetary history, and this acceptance persists quietly in the background of geographic consciousness. A quiet acknowledgement that some frontiers will remain forever beyond T. Deep beneath the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, where the Norwegian landscape disappears into layers of permanently frozen earth, lies one of the most impenetrable frontiers on our planet. The permafrost here extends hundreds of meters downward, creating a sealed archive of time itself, with temperatures that never rise above freezing even in the brief summer months. The deeper you attempt to venture into these frozen depths, the more the environment becomes actively hostile to human presence, with the pressure of accumulated ice and sediment creating conditions so extreme that the human body would be unable to withstand them. The permafrost contains layers of ancient organic material, extinct plant life, and microbial communities preserved in states that scientists can barely comprehend. Yet accessing these depths remains technically and practically impossible for direct human exploration. What drives our fascination with these unreachable zones is the fundamental human desire to understand the complete history of our planet, to peer into archives that contain answers to questions about climate, biology, and the very nature of life itself. We have created elaborate theories about what might exist in these depths, conducting remote sensing and drilling operations that retrieve tiny samples, yet these fragments only deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The permafrost represents a boundary between the known and unknowable, a realm where our instruments become extensions of our curiosity, but where human presence itself is rendered impossible. And yet we continue to invest resources and imagination into understanding what lies beyond our reach, accepting this fundamental limitation as simply part of the human condition. In Svalbard's global seed vault, humanity has paradoxically chosen to preserve the future by entrusting it to these same frozen depths, acknowledging that only permafrost can offer the permanence and stability requisite. Deep beneath the surface of the Celebes Sea, which sits between the Philippine Islands and the Indonesian archipelago, there exists a marine environment so remote and so profoundly isolated that human exploration remains virtually non-existent in most of its depths, creating a vast underwater realm where the pressure exceeds 800 atmospheres and where complete darkness reigns in the abyssal trenches that descend beyond 1,200 meters. The seafloor of this particular body of water is characterized by complex geological formations, including the Celebes Deep, which plunges to extraordinary depths where sediment layers have accumulated over millions of years. Yet these layers have never been studied directly by human observers who could actually witness the pristine conditions of this environment. What drives our collective inability to explore this space lies fundamentally in the physics of extreme pressure environments, where the human body cannot survive without technological intervention of the most sophisticated kind, and where even our most advanced submersibles can only operate for brief periods before their systems begin to fail under the crushing weight of the oceanic column above. The psychological mechanism at work here involves our normalization of ocean blindness, whereby we have become entirely accustomed to living on a planet whose majority remains utterly unknown to us, accepting without serious reflection that vast regions of our world will likely remain unexplored for generations to come, perhaps indefinitely. We have somehow rationalized that the deep ocean floor is a place that need not concern us immediately, that our scientific curiosity can be postponed, that the technological barriers are simply too great for our current civilization. And so we have collectively abandoned the impulse to truly investigate what lies in these crushing depths, preferring instead to focus our exploratory efforts on more accessible. Beneath the Weddell Sea, in the waters surrounding Antarctica, exists one of the most hostile and least explored environments on the entire planet, a realm so inaccessible that we know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the crushing depths that lie below this frozen ocean. The Weddell Sea is notorious for its unpredictable pack ice, violent storms, and temperatures that plunge far below freezing, creating conditions where even the most advanced research vessels struggle to maintain a foothold, and where the water itself becomes so cold and dense that exploration becomes not merely difficult but extraordinarily dangerous. The depths here, extending thousands of meters down into absolute darkness, contain ecosystems that have evolved in complete isolation from the rest of the world, where creatures have adapted to pressures so immense that their bodies would explode in our atmosphere, where bioluminescent organisms create their own light in an eternal night, and where the very chemistry of existence operates under rules we barely comprehend. What makes the Weddell Sea particularly impenetrable is the convergence of multiple impossible conditions simultaneously. The ice above prevents easy access and exit, the currents below are chaotic and unpredictable, the temperatures are lethal to human tissue within minutes, and the remoteness ensures that rescue operations are logistically nightmarish. We have normalized this inaccessibility by simply accepting that some places belong to the planet and not to us, that exploration has its limits, and that survival is more important than discovery. Yet beneath that acceptance lies a profound curiosity about what exists in those depths, what organisms thrive there, what minerals and geological formations shape that underwater landscape, all of which remains forever beyond our reach, waiting in the cold darkness of the world's most forbidding ocean. Beneath the Namib Desert, one of the oldest and driest places on Earth, lies a hidden network of underground aquifers that remain almost entirely unexplored by human investigation, locked away in geological chambers so deep and so isolated that we know remarkably little about their true extent, their chemical composition, or the ancient water systems that feed them. These aquifers exist in a state of profound isolation, separated from the surface world by hundreds of meters of compacted sand, rock, and sedimentary layers that have accumulated over millions of years, creating a barrier so complete that human access becomes practically impossible without industrial drilling operations that risk contaminating these pristine underground reservoirs. The water itself exists in a kind of temporal suspension, having been trapped in these aquifers for thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, predating human civilization, predating written history, sealed away in darkness where it has remained chemically unchanged and virtually undisturbed by the passage of time. What makes these aquifers particularly resistant to human exploration is not merely their depth or inaccessibility, but but rather the fundamental impracticality of studying them without potentially destroying the very thing we seek to understand. Since any attempt at comprehensive investigation would require drilling, sampling, and extraction that would inevitably alter or contaminate the delicate chemical and biological equilibrium that has existed in isolation. We have created a psychological framework that accepts this unknowability as simply the natural state of certain things on Earth, that we have unconsciously normalized the existence of vast systems of ancient water existing beneath our feet that we will never truly know, treating them as abstract concepts rather than tangible realities worthy of understanding. Deep beneath the volcanic landscapes of Alaska lie intricate networks of tunnels and caverns formed through millennia of geological activity. Passages that wind through solid rock and cooled lava flows in configurations so complex that even modern mapping technology struggles to fully document their extent and interconnections. These subterranean passages were created when molten lava flowed downward through the Earth's crust, leaving hollow channels behind as the outer layers cooled, while the inner molten material continued to move. And over countless volcanic cycles, these individual tunnels merged and branched into labyrinthine systems that now exist in permanent darkness beneath the Alaskan terrain. The physical challenge of exploring these spaces is compounded by factors that make them virtually inaccessible to human investigation. The extreme remoteness of their locations across interior Alaska, the unpredictable structural integrity of ancient tunnel walls that may collapse without warning, the presence of toxic volcanic gases that have accumulated undisturbed for centuries, and the absolute absence of natural light that makes navigation nearly impossible, even with modern equipment. Yet despite these concrete and measurable dangers, there exists a peculiar psychological phenomenon whereby these tunnels persist in human consciousness as places of inherent mystery precisely because they remain so fundamentally unreachable, as though the fact of their inaccessibility makes them seem more real and significant than many thoroughly explored locations. We have somehow normalized the existence of vast underground territories on our own planet that remain entirely unknown to us, treating them not as geographical features requiring investigation, but rather as mysterious entities that belong to the Earth alone, suggesting that human exploration has psychological limits beyond mere physical capability, and that we accept certain places remain. Deep beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea, stretching across thousands of square kilometers, there exist vast regions where oxygen has been completely depleted from the water column, creating what marine scientists call anoxic zones, dead spaces where almost no complex life can survive. These areas, which expand and contract with the seasons, represent some of the most inhospitable environments on the planet, yet they remain largely unexplored and poorly understood by human science. The formation of these zones occurs through a combination of geographical and physical circumstances that have persisted for centuries, creating a unique situation where the entire ecosystem has fundamentally reorganized itself around the absence of oxygen. The Baltic Sea's connection to the Atlantic Ocean is restricted by shallow straits, which limits water circulation and the replenishment of oxygen-rich waters from deeper oceanic regions. When freshwater from countless rivers enters the Baltic, it creates a density barrier that prevents thorough mixing between surface and deeper layers, effectively trapping and isolating the bottom waters in a state of permanent stagnation. Within these anoxic zones, the only organisms that can persist are specialized bacteria and archaea that have adapted to metabolize sulfur compounds and other exotic chemical reactions that do not require oxygen. The absence of oxygen creates a peculiar psychological barrier for human exploration, not merely because of the danger involved, but because our minds struggle to conceptualize environments so fundamentally divorced from life as we understand it. We have normalized the exploration of mountains, caves, and open oceans, yet these dead zones remind us that vast portions of our own planet remain as alien to human experience as distant planets, places where the rules of life itself seem suspended. Deep within the island of New Guinea lies one of the most remote and least explored regions on Earth, a mountainous terrain that rises sharply from dense jungle into cloud-covered peaks, where vast tracts of land remain almost entirely unmapped and largely inaccessible to modern exploration. The New Guinea Highlands, which span across Papua New Guinea and the Indonesian province of Papua, contain some of the most challenging geographical conditions imaginable, with steep valleys carved by ancient rivers, towering mountain ranges shrouded in perpetual mist, and ecosystems so isolated that they have developed unique species found nowhere else in the world. The terrain itself acts as a nearly impenetrable barrier, where narrow passes between mountains can only be navigated on foot through dense vegetation, where rainfall is so frequent and heavy that rivers swell unpredictably, transforming passable routes into impassable torrents within hours. The psychological effect of such extreme isolation stems from how the human mind processes the concept of the unknown frontier, how we are drawn to places that resist our understanding and mapping, yet simultaneously repelled by the physical danger and logistical impossibility they represent. Despite having technologies that allow us to observe distant planets and map entire ocean floors, we remain unable to fully document and explore a mountainous region on our own planet. A contradiction that persists because the highlands demand a level of physical endurance and risk acceptance that modern exploration has largely moved beyond. We have normalized the existence of this unexplored place through the simple acceptance that some regions of Earth will remain beyond our comprehensive reach, that not every square kilometer requires cataloging or understanding, and that perhaps there is something valuable in allowing certain places to retain their mystery and isolation in an age when almost everything else has. Deep beneath the surface of the Caribbean Sea lie vast underwater basins where oxygen has become almost entirely absent, creating some of the most inhospitable environments on our planet, regions so devoid of breathable conditions that even the most specialized deep-sea organisms cannot penetrate into their depths. And these anoxic zones persist in pockets throughout the Caribbean, particularly in areas like the Cariaco Basin off the coast of Venezuela, where the water column becomes so depleted of oxygen that it forms a boundary between the living world above and a realm of chemical stasis below. The formation of these basins occurs through a combination of geographical and oceanographic factors that create what scientists call a density stratification, where warmer, fresher water sits atop denser, colder saltwater, and this layering prevents the mixing and circulation that would normally allow oxygen-rich surface water to descend and refresh the deeper waters, meaning that once the oxygen is consumed by decomposing organic matter and bacterial respiration, there is no mechanism to replenish it, and the basin enters a state of permanent suffocation. The psychological weight of imagining such a place comes from understanding that these are not temporary phenomena, but rather stable, persistent features of the ocean that have existed for millennia, regions where time itself seems to move differently because nothing decays in the traditional sense, bacteria cannot thrive, and the usual decomposition processes that characterize life and death become suspended in a kind of biological limbo where organic matter simply accumulates in layers, creating a sedimentary record of countless years compressed into silent darkness. What makes these basins particularly unexplorable is not merely their depth or pressure, but the chemical hostility of their environment, the hydrogen sulfide that builds up in these anoxic waters, the absence of any visible. Franz Josef Land stands as one of the most isolated and inhospitable archipelagos on Earth, a collection of 191 islands scattered across the Arctic Ocean, roughly 900 kilometers from the North Pole, positioned between 80 degrees and 81 degrees north latitude, where the landscape exists in a state of perpetual extremity that renders human exploration and habitation profoundly difficult and inherently dangerous. The archipelago emerged from beneath retreating glaciers over the past several millennia, and today it remains covered almost entirely by thick ice sheets and glaciers that blanket approximately 85% of its total landmass, creating an environment where temperatures plunge to -40 degrees Celsius during winter months, where winds exceed 100 kilometers per hour with startling regularity, and where the polar night lasts for 130 days straight, leaving explorers in complete darkness for months while attempting to navigate terrain that shifts and cracks beneath their feet. The psychological mechanism that draws humans toward such places involves a peculiar attraction to extremes, a deep-seated desire to reach the edges of our world and to document what exists in those spaces where civilization has not yet firmly established itself, combined with an almost compulsive need to measure and categorize every corner of our planet, even when doing so offers no practical benefit and demands tremendous sacrifice from those who undertake such expeditions. We continue to send researchers, polar explorers, and scientific teams to Franz Josef Land, despite the fact that technological advancement could allow us to study this region remotely through satellites and other instruments, suggesting that the human impulse to physically travel to these forsaken places operates at a level deeper than rational necessity, rooted instead in existential wonder and the primal need to test O. Deep beneath the Atacama Desert in northern Chile lies a network of copper and lithium mines that descend to depths that have become increasingly inaccessible to human exploration, creating vast underground worlds that remain largely unmapped and unknown to the surface world. The San Pedro de Atacama region contains some of the oldest and deepest mining operations in South America, with certain shafts reaching depths exceeding 2,000 meters into the earth, far beyond the pressures and conditions that the human body can reasonably withstand without specialized equipment and years of training. The psychological barrier that prevents casual exploration of these depths stems from the genuine physical dangers inherent to deep mining environments, where the combination of extreme pressure, heat, toxic gases, and structural instability creates conditions fundamentally hostile to human presence. As these mines grow older and deeper, the infrastructure deteriorates, ventilation systems fail, and access becomes more restricted, not merely due to corporate policy, but because the geological reality itself becomes increasingly unforgiving and dangerous. What makes Chilean mine depths particularly fascinating from an exploratory perspective is how they represent a space that humanity deliberately created through extraction and tunneling, yet subsequently abandoned or restricted access to, turning our own excavations into forbidden territories that feel almost archaeological in nature. We have normalized this paradoxical relationship with the mines by accepting corporate mining restrictions and geological realities as legitimate barriers, rarely questioning whether these depths might still hold historical records, unique ecosystems, or geological formations worth documenting. The Arabian Sea stretches across approximately 2 million square kilometers of ocean between the Indian subcontinent and the Arabian Peninsula, yet its deepest regions remain almost entirely unexplored by human observation, a vast underwater wilderness that exists just beyond the threshold of our practical reach. The seafloor beneath these waters descends into trenches and abyssal plains where pressures exceed 500 atmospheres, where darkness is absolute and constant, where temperatures hover just above freezing despite the tropical heat radiating from the surface miles above. The Mascareñe Basin and the Arabian Basin contain geological formations that have never been directly observed by human eyes, spreading centers and fault lines that continue their ancient geological work undisturbed and unwitnessed, their movements measured in millimeters per year across timescales that dwarf human civilization entirely. We understand theoretically that these regions exist through seismic data and satellite measurements and mathematical models. We know the composition through indirect inference and comparison with accessible deep-sea environments, yet the lived reality of these spaces remains inaccessible to us, a dimension of our own planet that might as well exist on another world. The psychological mechanism that allows this gap between knowledge and experience to persist stems from our fundamental acceptance that some physical barriers are simply immutable, that the crushing weight of water and the distance involved create a practical impossibility that our minds have learned to tolerate without distress. We have normalized this exploration gap by treating it as equivalent to our inability to observe distant galaxies or extinct eras, as though the Arabian Sea Floor belongs to a category of human limitation that is philosophically acceptable rather than merely technical. Deep within the Siberian taiga, far beyond the reach of established settlements and accessible routes, exists a vast expanse of boreal forest so remote and inhospitable that human exploration remains perpetually incomplete, with millions of square kilometers remaining unmapped in any meaningful sense and vast territories where no human foot has ever pressed into the moss-covered ground. A wilderness so profound that satellite imagery provides our only consistent observation of its character, revealing endless waves of coniferous trees interrupted only by river valleys and the occasional clearing where fire or permafrost collapse has created temporary openings in the canopy. The practical barriers to exploration in this region are formidable and interconnected, where temperatures plunge to -50 degrees Celsius or lower during winter months, making equipment failure not merely inconvenient but immediately life-threatening, where the permafrost beneath the surface shifts unpredictably with climate fluctuations, creating unstable terrain that can collapse without warning, where insect populations during brief summer windows reach such extraordinary densities that they represent a genuine threat to human sanity and survival, and where the sheer distance from any point of rescue or resupply makes even well-funded expeditions logistically nightmarish and potentially fatal. Yet beyond these environmental factors lies a deeper psychological mechanism that maintains the taiga's isolation, a recognition in the human mind that some places resist the logic of exploration itself, that the cost-benefit analysis fundamentally breaks down when weighed against the genuine knowledge that emerges from understanding them. The Siberian taiga persists in human consciousness as a space that need not be fully known, a territory where the absence of human presence feels somehow appropriate rather than like a gap requiring closure, reflecting a subtle SH. Beneath the frozen surface of the Laptev Sea, one of the most remote and inhospitable bodies of water on Earth, lies a landscape so extreme and so fundamentally alien to human experience that it remains almost entirely unexplored. A vast repository of ancient ice and preserved organic matter that has accumulated over tens of thousands of years, in conditions so severe that the human body simply cannot endure them for meaningful periods of investigation. The permafrost here exists not merely as solid ground, but as an active, dynamic system where methane and carbon dioxide remain locked within the crystalline structure of ice, held in a state of suspended animation by temperatures that rarely rise above freezing even during the brief Arctic summer, and the shallow seafloor contains methane hydrates, frozen methane trapped in ice, that represent both a geological wonder and an environmental wildcard whose behavior remains largely theoretical because direct observation and sampling in such conditions presents obstacles that our current technology and human physiology cannot reliably overcome. The psychological mechanism that prevents exploration here operates through a simple calculus of survival itself. The Laptev Sea combines multiple layers of lethal environmental factors: extreme cold that induces hypothermia in minutes, ice formations that shift and crush equipment, perpetual darkness during winter months, isolation that makes rescue operations nearly impossible, and the sheer scale of the region which sprawls across an area larger than many nations with virtually no infrastructure or support systems. And this combination creates a natural barrier that feels not like an invitation to overcome, but like a firm boundary that the natural world has established against human presence. Beneath the endless expanse of golden dunes and ancient rock formations that stretch across Mongolia and China lies a world that remains almost entirely unknown to human exploration. A vast network of underground caverns, aquifers, and geological chambers that extend hundreds of meters below the surface in regions where the extreme aridity and hostile terrain make any form of systematic investigation nearly impossible. The Gobi Desert subsurface represents one of the largest unexplored underground realms on Earth, where vast quantities of groundwater flow through unseen passages and ancient cave systems carved over millions of years by water that no longer visibly exists on the surface, creating a hidden hydrological infrastructure that sustains the delicate balance of this seemingly lifeless landscape. What makes exploration so profoundly difficult is not merely the technical challenge of drilling and mapping through such immense depths across unstable geological formations, but rather the sheer economic and logistical impossibility of mounting sustained expeditions in a region where surface conditions are already among the harshest on the planet, where temperatures fluctuate violently and resources must be transported across hundreds of kilometers of unforgiving terrain. The psychological mechanism that allows us to accept the existence of this vast hidden world without feeling compelled to explore it stems from a fundamental human tendency to ignore what we cannot see and cannot immediately access, combined with the modern rationalization that satellite technology and remote sensing can somehow substitute for direct physical exploration. We have normalized the unexplored status of the Gobi subsurface by treating it as merely a geological curiosity rather than a frontier, by categorizing it alongside other inaccessible places and dismissing it with the comfortable assumption that if it truly mattered, we would find a way, yet this overall. The Caspian Sea remains one of Earth's most enigmatic bodies of water, a vast inland ocean bordered by 5 nations, yet fundamentally alien to human exploration and understanding, lying dormant beneath layers of darkness that extend deeper than most people realize. Descending into these depths means venturing into a realm where pressure increases exponentially, where temperatures plummet to near freezing, and where the biological landscape transforms into something altogether unfamiliar to surface dwellers, presenting challenges that dwarf those encountered in shallower continental waters. The deepest point reaches approximately 1,025 meters, creating an abyssal zone where traditional diving becomes physically impossible and remotely operated vehicles must shoulder the burden of human curiosity from a safe distance. The water itself holds particular mysteries, being brackish rather than fully saline, creating unique salinity gradients that confound standard oceanographic models and produce ecosystems unlike anything found in typical ocean basins. Hydrogen sulfide layers form naturally in these depths, creating zones of anoxia where life as we know it cannot flourish, yet somehow persists in forms we have barely documented. We have constructed narratives around oceanic exploration that somehow position the Caspian as less worthy of investigation than famous ocean trenches, perhaps because it lacks the geographic drama or international prestige of deeper waters, yet the psychological mechanism underlying this neglect runs deeper than mere logistics. There exists a peculiar human tendency to ignore what sits passively before us, to mythologize distant frontiers while overlooking the profound mysteries embedded in familiar geographies, and the Caspian Sea embodies this contradiction perfectly. The Kerguelen Islands sit isolated in the Southern Ocean, roughly halfway between Antarctica and Madagascar, a remote French territory where the interior remains almost entirely unexplored despite human presence spanning several centuries. The landscape consists of vast glaciated plateaus, deep fjords carved by ancient ice, and mountainous terrain so hostile that even reaching the interior requires crossing multiple natural barriers, including crevasse fields, unpredictable weather systems that shift within minutes, and valleys filled with equipment-destroying winds that regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. The interior's inaccessibility stems not merely from its physical distance from the research stations on the coast, but from the combination of perpetual cloud cover, magnetic anomalies that render navigation instruments unreliable, and a climate so severe that hypothermia can occur within hours regardless of preparation. What makes the Kerguelen interior psychologically compelling is how it represents a genuinely blank space on human maps despite technological advancement, a place where the traditional human impulse to map and catalog the world simply fails against the constraints of nature and economics. The cost of mounting expeditions to the interior far exceeds any scientific benefit, and the risks involved make insurance and ethical oversight nearly impossible to justify, creating a rational consensus that certain places should simply remain unknown. Yet this acceptance of unknowing feels somewhat revolutionary in an era where satellite imagery, drone technology, and digital mapping have made true wilderness increasingly rare, suggesting that some spaces persist in mystery not through physical impossibility, but through collective agreement that the effort required to penetrate them serves no compelling purpose. And this normalization of voluntary ignorance represents a quiet acceptance that human dominion over expel. Somewhere in the Arctic waters between Greenland and Norway lies a remote and isolated volcanic island called Jan Mayen, a place so hostile and inaccessible that it remains one of the least explored territories on our planet, and it is here that the Berenberg volcano rises dramatically from the frozen sea, a towering cone of dark basalt and perpetual ice that has captured the imagination of those who study Earth's most extreme environments. The volcano itself reaches nearly 2,000 meters into the Arctic sky, and its slopes are covered in permanent snow and glaciers that seem to defy the volcanic heat that still emanates from within, creating an otherworldly landscape where fire and ice exist in constant tension with one another. The island is so remote and so thoroughly inhospitable that no permanent human settlement has ever been established there, and the few scientists and researchers who have managed to reach it have done so only under the most carefully controlled circumstances, often requiring specialized equipment and months of logistical planning just to spend a few weeks conducting observations and measurements. The psychological draw of Jan Mayen Volcano lies in this very quality of absolute isolation and untouchability, in the fact that it represents a place on Earth that remains fundamentally beyond our grasp, a location where human presence is not just difficult but genuinely dangerous, where weather conditions can shift from manageable to life-threatening within hours, and where the combination of volcanic activity, extreme cold, and remoteness creates a barrier that feels almost deliberately designed by nature herself to keep us away. We persist in our fascination with this unreachable place despite the obvious logical reasons why we should leave it alone, and perhaps it is precisely because we have normalized the conquest of nearly every other corner of our planet that Mayen Volcano serves as a reminder that some plow. Deep beneath the Southern Ocean, far from any continent and beyond the reach of conventional exploration, lies the South Sandwich Trench, a geological feature so remote and inhospitable that it remains one of the least visited places on our planet. Located in the subantarctic waters east of South Georgia, this oceanic trench descends to depths exceeding 7,000 meters, placing it among the deepest underwater chasms known to science, yet it remains almost entirely unexplored by human observation. The trench exists within a region characterized by violent weather systems, treacherous seas, extreme cold, and currents so powerful they would overwhelm most research vessels, creating a natural barrier that has effectively isolated this geological wonder from sustained human investigation. The few expeditions that have ventured near this location have done so primarily through remote sensing technologies and satellite data rather than direct observation, gathering fragmentary information about a place that seems almost deliberately hidden by the combination of distance, climate, and the sheer indifference of the natural world. What makes the South Sandwich Trench particularly fascinating is how its inaccessibility persists not because of any malevolent force, but simply because the conditions required to reach it safely and conduct meaningful research demand resources, time, and technological sophistication that few institutions can justify allocating to such a remote location. The psychological mechanism underlying our acceptance of this place's anonymity stems from what might be called the hierarchy of relevance in human consciousness, whereby we prioritize exploration and understanding of spaces that directly affect our lives or satisfy our curiosities about inhabited regions, while the depths of the Southern Ocean remain abstract, theoretical, and ultimately deprioritized in the collective human agenda. Beneath the surface of the Okavango Delta in Botswana lies a world that remains almost entirely unexplored despite its proximity to human settlements and tourism infrastructure. A vast network of underwater channels, flooded caverns, and submerged passages that extend through the porous limestone bedrock beneath the swamps and lagoons. The delta itself is one of Africa's most remarkable ecosystems, where the Okavango River terminates in an inland delta rather than reaching the ocean, creating a labyrinth of waterways and islands that shift seasonally. And yet the underwater dimension of this ecosystem remains profoundly mysterious because the water is often murky with sediment and organic matter, making visibility nearly impossible for even the most experienced divers who dare to venture into these submerged passages. The psychological barrier that prevents exploration of these depths operates on multiple levels, beginning with the fundamental human discomfort with darkness and the unknown, intensified by the genuine dangers of cave diving in freshwater systems where disorientation occurs rapidly, and rescue becomes nearly impossible once a diver ventures beyond the point of safe return. The waters contain diverse and sometimes dangerous fauna, including crocodiles, hippopotamuses, and venomous water snakes, all of which create a logical deterrent that our minds amplify into something even more formidable through imagination, and the stories we tell ourselves about what might exist in unexplored underwater caverns. Yet despite the obvious and genuine hazards, we have normalized our collective ignorance of these depths, treating them as part of the natural landscape rather than as genuine mysteries that remain virtually unvisited, accepting that some places will remain unknown not because they are truly inaccessible, but because we have decided that exploration is neither safe enough nor valuable enough to justify the attempt, and so the Okavan. Beneath the surface of the Black Sea exists one of Earth's most profound and scientifically fascinating dead zones, a massive layer of water entirely devoid of oxygen that begins at roughly 200 meters depth and extends down to the seafloor nearly 1,200 meters below. This anoxic layer, which comprises the vast majority of the Black Sea's water column, represents an environment so chemically hostile to most forms of life that it has remained almost entirely unexplored and largely inaccessible to human investigation, despite its proximity to densely populated coastlines and major cities. The boundary between the oxygenated upper waters and this oxygen-free abyss is so sharply defined that it creates a distinct chemical transition zone. And as you descend past this threshold, the water transforms into an environment dominated by hydrogen sulfide and other toxic compounds that would corrode equipment and poison any organism dependent on aerobic respiration. The creation of this anoxic layer stems from a combination of geographical and hydrographical factors that have persisted for thousands of years, including the Black Sea's limited connection to other ocean basins through the narrow Bosporus Strait, which restricts water exchange and prevents the deeper waters from being replenished with oxygen from the surface or from the Atlantic Ocean beyond. The heavy freshwater input from numerous major rivers like the Danube and Dnieper creates a strong density stratification, meaning that the lighter freshwater floats atop the heavier saltwater below, and this separation effectively prevents the mixing that would otherwise allow oxygen to penetrate to deeper depths. Despite our modern technological advances and the scientific importance of understanding this ecosystem, the anoxic layer remains one of the least explored environments on Earth, a place where submarines rarely venture and where the extreme chemistry and complete absence of. Nestled between Iceland and Norway in the North Atlantic Ocean, the Faroe Islands sit atop one of Earth's most treacherous and mysterious underwater landscapes, a seabed that remains largely unmapped and virtually unexplored despite its proximity to inhabited land and modern civilization. The waters surrounding these remote islands plunge into abyssal depths, where currents move with such violent intensity that they have earned the nickname of some of the most dangerous tidal races on the planet, creating whirlpools and eddies that swallow sound and light alike, transforming the ocean floor into a realm that might as well exist on another world entirely. The seabed itself is characterized by dramatic underwater canyons, towering ridges, and geological formations that shift and change in ways that remain poorly understood even by marine scientists, creating an environment so hostile and unpredictable that the cost and risk of exploration far outweighs the perceived benefit of understanding what lies beneath those cold, churning waters. The human mind struggles to reconcile the idea that places so close to civilization, so near to fishing communities and modern infrastructure, could remain fundamentally unknown and inaccessible. Yet this contradiction persists because we have simply accepted the ocean's refusal to surrender its deepest secrets without catastrophic cost. We have normalized our ignorance of the Faroe Islands seabed by convincing ourselves that proximity to human habitation is somehow equivalent to understanding, that because people live above it, we fundamentally know what lies below, when in reality the darkness and pressure and complexity of that underwater world remain as alien and unreachable as the surface of distant planets that we observe with telescopes from our secure positions on dry land. Deep beneath the Arctic waters of the Barents Sea, where the Norwegian and Greenland seas merge into one of the most inhospitable marine environments on Earth, lies a vast expanse of seafloor that remains almost entirely unexplored by human observation. The Barents Sea stretches across roughly 1.4 million square kilometers of frigid water, with depths reaching over 600 meters in certain regions. Yet the floor itself remains shrouded in darkness and mystery that we have only begun to comprehend through remote sensing and the occasional deep-sea expedition. The extreme conditions that define this region create a profound barrier to direct human exploration. Water temperatures hover near freezing, the pressure at the deepest points would crush an unprotected human body instantly, and the distance from the surface means that even the most advanced submersibles can only spend limited time studying these depths before they must return to safety. The seafloor itself contains an intricate topography of ridges, trenches, and plains that have been shaped by millions of years of geological processes. Yet the details of these formations remain largely unknown except through the interpretations of sonar data and satellite imagery. What makes this particular inaccessibility so compelling is the psychological mechanism at work. We have normalized our inability to explore the Barents Sea floor by accepting that some places are simply too hostile for human presence. Yet this acceptance has paradoxically freed us from the obligation to try, creating a strange comfort in the idea that some mysteries can remain mysteries without our intervention. The Barents Sea floor persists in this state of profound human ignorance not because we lack the theoretical capability to explore it more thoroughly, but because we have collectively decided that the risk, expense, and difficulty are not justified by the potential knowledge gain, and so we continue our lives on the surf. Deep beneath the sandstone plateaus and limestone formations of Tasmania lies one of Earth's most formidable underground realms, a labyrinth of cave systems so extensive and treacherous that large portions remain entirely unmapped and fundamentally inaccessible to human exploration. The Tasmanian caves, particularly those found in regions like the Mole Creek Karst and the areas surrounding the Florentine Valley, contain passages that descend into darkness so complete, and conditions so extreme that even the most experienced spelunkers find themselves confronted with impassable sumps, vertical shafts of unknown depth, and narrow fissures that seem to reject human intrusion with an almost deliberate hostility. These underground networks were carved over millions of years by acidic water dissolving the soluble rock, creating chambers of staggering proportions alongside passages so confined that movement requires not just technical skill, but a kind of psychological surrender to complete vulnerability. The psychological mechanism at work here involves the human relationship with the unknown combined with physical limitation, creating a particular species of dread that emerges when we encounter spaces designed by geological processes rather than human intention, spaces that existed in their current form long before our species learned to walk upright, spaces that demonstrate our fundamental insignificance within the natural world. We have normalized the existence of these impenetrable spaces by simply accepting that some places on Earth will remain beyond our reach, by declaring certain caves too dangerous or too remote for conventional exploration. Yet this acceptance masks something deeper about human nature itself. There persists within us an undeniable drive to explore, to map, to know and categorize every corner of our world, and the Tasmanian cave systems stand as a quiet reminder that this drive will never be fully satisfied, that nature are. Deep within the former basin of the Aral Sea lies one of Earth's most contaminated and inhospitable environments, a place where the toxic remnants of decades of industrial mismanagement have transformed the exposed seabed into a landscape of chemical and biological hazards that few humans have ever dared to explore. During the 20th century, the Soviet Union diverted the two primary river systems that fed the Aral Sea for irrigation purposes, causing the water level to drop catastrophically and exposing hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of poisoned sediment that had accumulated on the seafloor over countless generations. This exposed bed is saturated with pesticides, herbicides, heavy metals including lead and uranium, and residual salts that create a white, crusty surface resembling snow, but containing compounds that would cause severe respiratory damage, neurological harm, and systemic toxicity to any human who ventured across it without extreme protective equipment. The psychological barrier to exploration functions on multiple levels simultaneously, beginning with the simple understanding that the human body was never designed to process these particular cocktails of chemicals in such concentrated forms, and continuing through the recognition that any exploration would require such extensive protective measures that the experience would be entirely isolated from normal sensory perception. What persists most strangely is our collective acceptance of this phenomenon as simply another consequence of past choices rather than an active, ongoing emergency, as though the passage of time and bureaucratic transitions have somehow rendered the toxins less lethal or the landscape less worthy of concern, when in reality the poisons remain virulent and patient, waiting beneath the dust for any organism foolish enough to engage with them directly, making the Aral Sea's toxic bed a monument not only to environmental destruction, but to our